Okay, thank you everyone. I think we're going to make a start. I'm delighted to see there's so much interest in scrutiny, but something tells me you're not here for my chairing skills, or my jokes evidently either. But thank you all for coming. Before we crack on with the content, I need to do the usual and read the Filming at Meetings declaration. Please note that this meeting may be filmed or recorded by the Council for live or subsequent broadcast via the Council's internet site or by anyone attending the meeting using any communication method. Although we ask members of the public recording, filming or reporting on the meeting not to include the public seating areas, members of the public attending the meeting should be aware that we cannot guarantee that they will not be filmed or recorded by others attending the meeting. Members of the public participating in the meeting, e.g. making deputations, asking questions, making oral protests, should be aware that they are likely to be filmed, recorded or reported on. By entering the meeting room and using the public seating area, you are consenting to be filmed and to the possible use of those images and sound recording. The chair of the meeting has the discretion to terminate or suspend filming or recording if, in her opinion, continuation of the filming, recording or reporting would disrupt or prejudice the proceedings, infringe the rights of any individual, or may lead to the breach of a legal obligation of the Council. Do we have any apologies for absence?
Apologies for absence from Mark Chapman, one of the co-opted members. Sorry, apologies from Mark Chapman, who is one of our co-opted members.
Thank you. Do we have any urgent business?
As it's a special meeting, there is no urgent business.
Thank you. Do we have any declarations of interest? No. Thank you. So we move straight on to the business at hand. The committee, Overview and Scrutiny Committee, has been asked to scrutinise the Cabinet decision on Red House Yard, 432 West Green Road. The decision cannot be implemented until the committee has undertaken its scrutiny. But just to be clear, Overview and Scrutiny is not retaking the Cabinet decision. The call-in is specifically related to the decisions taken by Cabinet on the 9th of July, which are set out on page 19 of the agenda pack. The committee will be following the process set out in the section of the Monitoring Officer's report, which is contained in the supplementary pack. The call-in is stating that the original decision is outside of the budget and policy framework. If the committee determines that the policy is within the budget and policy framework, there are three possible outcomes to the call-in, as set out. As per paragraph 6.4 of the Monitoring Officer's report, if the committee determines that the decision is outside the budget and policy framework, Overview and Scrutiny must revert the matter back to the original decision maker with a request to reconsider it on the grounds that it is incompatible with the policy and budgetary framework. We have received two requests for deputations, and I ask the first deputation, that is Mrs. Hilary Adams, and other members of the community to come forward, please. I will invite the deputation to introduce itself and then speak, and then we'll have the opportunity for members to ask questions of the deputation.
Right, I just want to do very brief introductions of the deputation. I'm Hilary Adams, I'm a local resident. Jacob Secker has extensive experience as a housing worker and has undertaken significant work in relation to this meeting around the finances of this scheme. Doug Thorpe is a recently retired officer of the local government ombudsman's office, and he's got extensive expertise on the responsibilities of councils. Natasha Sivarandam is a retired barrister with extensive knowledge of the public sector equality duties, including acts and omissions by councils and the legal and fiduciary responsibilities of councillors. And Stuart McNamara has the insight into constitutional accountability. Phil Rose has decades of experience in housing and the issues of homelessness and is a local activist, as we all are. So the presentation I wish to make is as follows. Our concerns centre on the lack of public accountability demonstrated within the report. All costs of the sale and subsequent repurchase of public land, property and the open space are withheld from the public in the exempt reports. The public are therefore unable to make any meaningful assessment of whether this represents best value. I note that the additional report from Dan Hawthorne in his rebuttal of the need for a call-in largely points again to the hidden reports unavailable to the public, who are after all expected to pay for all of this. We're concerned that despite a long history of delays and problems with this site and the current developer, no risk assessment of the proposed plan is included in the report. We are instead told that the developers are the only ones able to deliver on time. No evidence to support this is presented. It is simply given as somehow self-evident. The vital missing information held within the exempt papers are available to only a small percentage of elected councillors, but subsequently many of the detailed financial and contractual decisions are to be delegated to officers. This is not a sufficiently robust basis for decision-making. This serves only to add to the growing public perception that became widely discussed around the discredited HDV, that is, officers, not elected councillors, who drive the political agenda, particularly in relation to regeneration. It's important to understand what this deal looks like to ordinary members of the public. It presents as the most overly complex and incomprehensible deal involving multiple strange arrangements where public land moves back and forth, but ultimately ends with only 53% returning to public ownership. This feels like an exercise in smoke and mirrors, and in the public perception seems to be made overly complicated, giving the impression that decisions are shrouded in mystery in order to exclude us from any meaningful engagement in the decisions that impact upon our community. A scrutiny investigation is the appropriate vehicle for a transparent examination and thus democratic oversight of the proposal and all viable alternative options. I note that the officer report cites the delay this may cause as a reason to reject this idea, but surely a central purpose of properly examining decisions is to establish for the future a more sustainable method of delivery. This administration made a political manifesto commitment to build council homes on council land, not simply buy off-plan at market rates. The rush to do things quickly so easily turns into doing them badly. Our view is that we should be able to use this site in its entirety to build more council homes at the cheapest cost and retain our most valuable asset, which is the land. Elements of the report that suggest the council is unable to overcome the difficulties presented by the land assembly, of which they already own the vast majority, and to negotiate with a small church regarding access rights presents as somewhat feeble. It seems the lack of capacity starts at the top when it comes to the council making deals with the private sector to fully benefit the community. Calling a rethink on this development and undertaking some proper scrutiny would go some way to help rebuild trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary, and to the rest of your team. I'll now take questions from members. Councillor Connor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Hilary. That was very clear, and to all the other members that are sitting at the table. So did I understand that correctly, that you're asking for this decision to, when you say go back to scrutiny or to be scrutinised more, are you talking about this evening, or are you talking about going back to housing scrutiny?
Well, if I had a choice, which clearly it's not my choice, I think there should be a full scrutiny in the housing scrutiny, yes. But at the very least, I think you should be making that recommendation that the Cabinet rethink its decision in light of the very many concerns that have been raised.
Councillor Moeed.
First of all, want to thank you for taking the time to come and speak to us, and you outline a number of very important concerns around public accountability, and that your concerns around how complex and incomprehensible, as you say, this scheme seems. You also make reference to HDV, and I just want to understand that obviously this scheme is not comparable in any way to HDV in the way that it is structured. And could you clarify if that's your understanding as well?
The reference to the HDV was an example of the public perception, and in the HDV, which became, nationwide news, the public perception of Haringey was that officers are running the council rather than councillors, and what people thought had changed in the recent elections was just that, and that for people who live in Tottenham in particular, regeneration of their area is a major area that leaves them feeling in a whole range of areas, and we've got people from various campaigns here in the audience, that they're left feeling as long-standing members of the community that their role is to be pushed out of the way to benefit developers. And so that's why this reminds us of the worst aspects. And clearly the scale of the HD was extraordinary. But what we're worried about is that if all of the plans that you have to build future council housing and future housing developments come under the purview of this arrangement where developers seem to get strangely beneficial deals, that what we'll have ultimately is the HDV by stealth, whereas we thought we defeated the HDV in its massive format, and yet we could end up with the same problem. So, yeah, that's what I think about it.
Councillor Jogi.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Hilary, and everybody for coming. I, similar to colleagues, was struck by the comments around the lack of public accountability and the concerns around residents not being able to make their own judgment on this set of proposals. And also, I think, the lack of trust in the process. I think that's an important... Sorry, Kevin. Not often told that. Okay, my question is, there were concerns raised about residents not being able to have the space to make a judgment on this, nor express their trust in the process. And so I'm interested to know how you think we can facilitate residents having their judgment, and what should be done differently to ensure they feel included and aware of what the proposals are.
I don't want to hog all the questions, so I was going to ask Stuart, perhaps, if he would be willing to answer that one. That's his area of expertise. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair and Councillor Jogi. I think it would help just to point out a very clear ambiguity and contradiction in the Council's constitution, because it goes to the very heart of what backbench councillors have access to on behalf of the public. 4.22 of Part 5.
Sorry, Chair. The question needs to be answered. And sorry, I'm making a reference to the fact that the question has been asked, and that question needs to be answered. The question wasn't in respect of the Council's constitution. Sorry for intervening. It wasn't in respect of the Council's constitution.
Sorry.
Councillor Nevis, I thought you were chairing the meeting.
Sorry. Stuart, you are going to arrive at answering the question, aren't you? Yeah. Please do then. Thanks
for clarifying that, because I always had this old-fashioned view that councillors chair meetings, not officers. Very quickly, Chair. 4.22 of Part 5, Section B of the Council's Constitution says, whilst members of the Council have the same rights as the public in seeking and obtaining public documents or information under freedom of information legislation, this is not the case in relation to exempt and confidential information. And yet, 24.9 and 24.10 of Part 4, Section D of the same Constitution says, all members of the Council will be entitled to inspect any document except those available only in draft form in the possession or under the control of the executive which relates to any key decision unless paragraph 24.1 above applies, and these rights of a member are additional to any other right he or she may have. This constitution is a mess, and the reason why this committee has quite rightly, and I think needs to be commended as such, for agreeing to hold this call-in, and the reason why the call-in has had to be called and why this deputation has been requested is because if backbench councillors had had the right to see the exempt information, which I haven't seen and most of the public of course wouldn't have seen, we would perhaps have better knowledge of the information which lends itself to why this is a poor decision. And it really calls into question, if you've got key decisions relating to the disposal of land and assets, which this does, then all backbenchers should be given access to that information at the very earliest opportunity and not have to fight for that, because ward members in St Anne's, I believe, but this could equally apply to any regeneration scheme in the borough, have the right to expect that their ward councillors and any other councillors, including yourselves as backbenchers, senior backbenchers as the members of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, have access to all information, so that when officers recommend schemes such as this, they have all the information. Because unfortunately, this call-in has been made necessary because of the lack of that information. And I have to say, there are serious questions to be asked, which I think really this committee would do well, I think, to look at considering doing a scrutiny review into this issue and possibly even recommending that the Constitution needs to be reviewed.
Thank you for those comments. There's plenty there to digest. Do we have any other questions from members? Anyone who hasn't spoken yet who would like to speak? Councillor Moeed? Yeah, so the net effect of this Red House scheme is that we get 46 council homes within the lifetime of this administration. That's 46 families that will be moved out of temporary accommodation. And any attempt to delay this scheme, to send it back to the Cabinet or to look at alternatives will mean that we are not able to achieve that within the lifetime of this administration. Could you please comment on the people in temporary accommodation and the conditions they often find themselves in, and that if we were not going ahead with this, the impact that will have on them?
Sorry, I'd just like to make a comment there. I've been a housing officer and a homeless persons officer for 30 years, and sorry.
Put it closer to you.
I've got 30 years' experience of working in frontline housing, so I think I know what homeless people are facing. When we deal with them, we don't look at the immediate needs, we look at long-term help. Now, the issue here is that we will house 46 people. There's thousands, 3,000 people on the waiting list that need helping. And what we're asking for is not for just for 46 people to be housed immediately. We're asking for thousands. And the problem with this plan is it doesn't do anything to address the thousands others. It's a piecemeal plan. And what we're asking for is a strategy that actually looks at the thousands and actually has sympathy for the thousands, not just for 46. And this is what our problem is you focus on 46 and make your defence of a very secretive, very concealed deal around 46 people or 46 families, whereas in fact there's 1,000 more coming, and we want a strategy that actually builds council housing on council land for thousands of people, and that's what the manifesto promise was, and we're asking you to deliver on it.
I'm going to take... Councillor Dogan was indicating, and since he hasn't spoken, I'll take you first.
So you talked about the strategy. So could you just explore a bit more how to achieve more council homes? Because you say you worked as a frontline officer, am I right? Yeah, if you can just explore a bit more. Thank you.
Well, in a second I'd like Jacob to say something about the finances of it all. But what we're talking about here is a plan that will spend £15 million on building and buying off-the-shelf 46 homes. Now, you can build those houses, those properties, much cheaper than the 330 per thousand on average, that is being proposed to pay for the houses, but that's £15 million. If you spend it on 46, where are you going to get the 15 million to buy the next 46 and the next 46 and the next 46? You're going to run out of money very quickly. So what you have to have is an overall strategy to work out how to provide those homes as cheaply and effectively as possible. And that takes planning. It doesn't mean to say that you want the quickest solution, you want the most effective solution. And that is what is important. It's all very well to talk about the immediate need, but there's a need that comes long term down the road. Maybe Jacob would like to say a bit more.
Basically, I mean, getting back to the Red House, the plan's a mess in terms of delivering housing and helping people in temporary accommodation. It's a complete mess. The cost of building council flats, we were told, on council land is £200,000 per unit. That's what I was told in this room when we were talking about building new flats on the site of Tangmere on Broadwater Farm. Okay, now, you're building council flats and it's land that you own. I know some of it you don't, but most of it's land you own, and you're paying $335,000 when you could be just directly doing this yourself, building council flats on the council land here for $200,000. That's £130,000 per unit you're paying for this mess, for not building directly on council land. £130,000 per unit. So you're losing £6 million. That's £6 million. Even if, look, put it this way, even if you could only build 46 council homes on this land for £200,000, you'd save £6 million, and you could use that £6 million to build council homes elsewhere. What on earth is this deal about? This doesn't add up at all. These figures are ridiculous. And when you say you've done a study to show that this is best value, I mean, look, as it says, you know, on page 10, where are we? Paragraph 4.47 of the response to the call-in. I mean, what it's saying is that, oh, we've done this study to show this is the best deal, but it's all exempt. So the key issue that we're all here about tonight, that this is a bad deal, this is a very expensive way of providing council homes that's going to waste your money and prevent you building council homes elsewhere or on this land. The key issue we're all here about, that's all exempt. What a surprise. This is just like it was for years and years of Haringey Council decisions. The key issues are always exempt. Why? Because you don't really want us to know the true facts. You know, the council doesn't want us to know what's going on. And that's not good enough. That's got to change. That's why you're having so many problems over this.
Thank you. Thank you. You can have 1 minute. You can have 1 minute.
Thank you. I just want to make a point about your statutory duties. If you look at the reports, including the one from back in 2015 on the Red House, it says, in terms of equalities, that it's not applicable. In fact, your officers are in breach of the public sector equality duty because there are equalities implications. One is one based on the protected characteristic of religion, because this scheme aims to add more space for a church which has very little basis in the borough, which has not a huge membership, at the expense of other groups. In addition, you're going to close down a community meeting place and hand that over to the church without looking at the protected equalities impacts, and there's no equality impact assessment being carried out. It seems your officers don't understand that religion is actually listed as a protected characteristic. In addition, we know that the Guardians have put about 55 to 60 tenants there who are paying about £380 a month to live in the Red House, living as Guardians, and most of those residents are a mixture of ethnic minority people, refugees and people in housing need with no access to public funds. This has equality impact assessment implications, and no work has been done on that. That's a breach of this council's public sector equality duty, contrary to section 149 of the Equality Act 2010. And it really is important that Haringey Council takes its duties under the law. It is outrageous that officers have written that equalities are not applicable in every single report on this. I could go on, because as you know, that's my area of expertise, but you've only given me a minute. The final point I want to make is this. The report of the officers also refers to advice from a QC. Now, as a former barrister, I can tell you that a QC's advice is meaningless and worthless unless we know what detailed information the QC had access to in order to give his advice. If the QC does not have access to all the relevant information and to exempt reports, the QC can't give meaningful, effective or timely legal advice. So the officer's just simply saying, oh, we've run it past the QC and the QC says it's fine, is absolute legal drivel and is meaningless, because any good barrister, as I was in the past, will know that it all depends on the quality of the information that you have access to before you give a legal opinion. I hope those comments have been helpful. You really need to carry out an equality impact assessment. It's a statutory duty, and you run the risk of being judicially reviewed all over again and this whole process being held up. So please do your job and demand that this is dealt with. It's a statutory duty.
Thank you. I'm going to allow Councillor Jogi wanted to make one more remark, and then I think we're going to have to move on and keep motoring, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Chair. This final question takes 3 parts, and I'll ask all 3 and then perhaps work out the best way to respond, if that's all right. Firstly, what assessment does the deputation make of the fact that only 53% of public land will be returned, of the site will be returned to public hands? Hilary, you noted risk in your initial comments, and I just want to know if you can say a word about falling house prices, the kind of macroeconomic environment. Jacob, perhaps you could come in on this too. Brexit uncertainty with the move to a no-deal Brexit, that will no doubt have an impact. Naturally, I'm banging on about it, something that's important to me. And the last point, Chair, if you'll indulge me, the third bit of my third point question. The report indicated that an all-council option would be cheaper. Would you have liked to have seen Cabinet produce a fully costed option that saw council homes built on council land?
Okay, on the 53%, well, actually that means 47% going permanently into the private sector. We would want to, and it also means that the housing that's built on that is private housing and will be for the benefit of a private developer. The nature of that developer over time, it's not just down to them. There is, with Brexit, with the overextension of the private market elsewhere, there's a falling market in private building. It's not clear what percentage of the recent developments are going to be sold. So if the project does, the 53% of land that comes back into the public sector is the best that can happen. And that depends on the project delivering as planned all that it promises. The likelihood of that happening has to be in doubt, and we would like to see a proper evaluation of that. In terms of what we could build on land, I noticed the Director of Housing refers to officers having done an indicative assessment of the council building its own property. Well, what is an indicative assessment? Why do we not start from the premise that what should be explored first and foremost is how the council can build its own council property on public land, keeping it in the public sector, and only move to other options if that is shown to be not possible? In this case, is start from the idea that this Port Simon deal is a nice, easy earner, and what you do then is discount the other options. So we would want to see, yes, much more than an indicative assessment by officers. We want to see a comprehensive assessment of how the council could build on its own land and keep as much of it as possible in the public sector and maximise the number of council houses on that land.
The only thing that Doug didn't address in your question, I think, was the point I'd made about the risk assessment. And what I was getting at, really, is I've worked in government local government for 32 years, and I've read a lot of council documents, and you start to see a pattern over the years, which is that the officers' preferred option gets a massive write-up, looks like it's the only way forward, that everything is going to be rosy in that particular garden. And what you don't get when that is there, you do get extensive dismissals of all the other possible options, that somebody puts a lot of work into the report that says, no, this won't work because of that reason, that won't work because of this other reason at great length. And I noticed in this report particularly that when I went through it, that there was nothing other than good to be said about this report. And that of itself leaves me questioning the veracity of those claims, because in this world, as you helpfully described in the possible scenarios that may go wrong, that we're facing this very uncertain economic climate, that there are so many things that can go wrong. And with this one, we've already got the very same developer that's shown us exactly what can go wrong, because they have sat on that site for I don't know how many years and failed to deliver.
Thank you very much. Thank you. There was some very full and challenging commentary there. We're going to have to close this section, and I'm going to ask the Cabinet Member and officers where appropriate to respond to the deputation before we move on to the second deputation.
I would like to thank the deputation for coming, attending this evening, and presenting their concerns and answering questions. Obviously, I understand your concerns about the issue of the exempt part, but you appear to have quite a lot of information already, because you were quoting figures which were supposed to be in the exempt part. So I don't know if anything so far has been exempt, because you have already that information in terms of the details that you've provided. I would obviously, as you know, as local government officers, that transactions such as these are dealt with in the exempt part, because they are commercially sensitive. And so I obviously share your concern, but the council, both members and officers, have to comply with the requirement of the law. Thank you.
So, sorry, Councillor, just before, I think, you want to hear?
I will briefly respond as well, and then I'll pass on to officers. So again, like I echo Councillor Ajay's response on, and I actually agree. I wish we weren't in a circumstance where a lot of information like this has to be exempt. I share those frustrations, because I think actually it's a lot easier to make a case for something like this if a lot of that information was more publicly available, and it would certainly make our task a lot easier. But ultimately, what I also recognise that a lot of this information isn't just to protect commercial interests, it's also to protect the financial interests of the council as well. So if a lot of that information is out there, it then puts the council in a difficult negotiating situation at times. And I actually tend to agree. There are circumstances where I think actually we should have a look at the constitution of the council and see how we can, because there's always room for improvement. There is, nobody is here to say that we're a perfect scenario in terms of information that's out there, and in terms of where we are as a council in terms of access to that information. And like Charles, I agree. I mean, it appears that that access has been provided, because a lot of the information that you were talking about, and I've heard on the grapevine, is information that was exempt. So we're not going to split hairs on that tonight. I mean, I tend to be in favour, as I said, of that information as far as possible being made available. I'd also like to respond to Phil's rightly brought up situation about or issue about the fact that this particular site is not going to solve the housing crisis in Haringey or London. 46 homes, yes, it is a drop in the ocean, but it's quite important to 46, not 46 people, 46 families. Let's be clear about that. So 46 people and 46 families are very, very different. But also, at the same time, being absolutely clear that this is an unbalanced decision, and I disagree actually. I don't think the report made an all-singing, all-dancing appraisal of this particular scenario, but Phil raised the issue about the overall strategy. I'd like to remind you, Phil, that actually when we had a discussion about this on social media, I actually pointed out to you that at the same meeting that this decision was made on this particular site, there was also a very, very large document which was the strategy for our overall programme. Unfortunately, I was removed from that discussion having said that, and my response was deleted, unfortunately. However, what I would say is I would encourage you at this point to go back to that publicly available housing delivery plan and read it. This figures in it. It's one of the sites which are specified, and it's the only site which is specified within that programme, which is our own site but involves an acquisition as well. So the claim that's made that this is something that will be happening all the time is incorrect.
Thank you. I know that everyone in the gallery is very passionate about these issues, but I do ask that we don't talk while others speak, because it really means we can't hear anything and we're none of us any the wiser. So please don't do that. I'm asking that politely. Thank you. Thank you. I'm aware of what my job is. Thank you. No, I'm going to move on to officers. Stephen, please.
Chair, very quickly, the point was made about the Council's equality duties. Just to draw this to the committee's attention, in the Cabinet report, at page 14, this is the first dispatch. At page 14, from paragraph 8.10 to paragraph 8.13, the equalities issues were dealt with in there.
Sorry.
It doesn't deal with the issue properly or in statutory terms.
Please, Natasha, thank you. Thank you very much for your deputation. You've raised some very important and challenging questions. We're very grateful that you've come to see us. I hope you feel we've given you plenty of time to elaborate on the issues for you. I'm now going to call forward Mr. Chowdhury, who's also going to present his deputation to us. Mr. Chowdhury, if you'd introduce yourself and also the organisation that you represent.
Good evening. My name is Ghulam, and I'm representing the formerly known as Bangladeshi Women's Association, the Mitali Community Centre, and I just have 2 sentences really to say. I've just really concerned. I don't understand the details of what's going on, but it does concern me very greatly that the first paragraph of the call-in, which I read yesterday, seems to raise the possibility of the Mitali Community Centre being at risk in terms of building houses. And I just wanted to voice my concern, really. And while we all appreciate the need to build more homes, I'm sure we can also agree that it would be wholly unreasonable and unjust to do so at the expense of another group of people, many of whom are very vulnerable, weak women. If I had a lot more time, I had about 24 hours notice of this meeting, and I would have brought in some of our beneficiaries, our members, to really showcase the sorts of activities that we're doing. That's all I really had to say. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. Is that okay?
Mr. Chowdhury, would you say a little bit more about your organisation and what you do? I understand you're the leaseholder of the Mitali Centre,
Yes.
is that correct?
Yes.
Do you want to say a little bit more about what you do as an organisation?
Okay,
You're a charity, is that correct?
Yes. So some of the activities at the Mitali Centre are counselling, computer classes, teaching Microsoft Word, Office, email, CV writing support, a Bangladeshi women's tea morning. Might find it hard to believe. Some of these women, they've never worked, they don't know how to read, they don't know how to write, they have no income. And homework club, ESOL classes. At the beginning of the summer holiday, we had an anti-knife event. We had 38 black boys attending. Most of their mothers have attended the centre at some point. That's how they knew of us. And I thought it was a very successful program because at the beginning, all 38 of them, they were local boys from Haringey. Every single one of them expressed that carrying a knife was actually okay, perfectly acceptable thing to do on the streets of London for self-defense, in case another boy from the wrong postcode suddenly turned up. At the end of the program, it was a full-day program we had, and out of the 38, 32 of them had changed their minds. They said, actually, it's not an okay thing to do. So if I had a lot more time, I could have really given you a really detailed breakdown of what we have done in the past, what we intend to do in the future moving forward. But I think, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chowdhury.
Yes.
Now we'll have some questions from members now. Councillor Connor, you haven't spoken for a while.
Sorry.
Lovely, thank you. That's fine. Well, thank you very much for coming this evening, and I think you've definitely given us a flavour of what you do there. So my understanding is that your community centre or your organisation within this community centre isn't actually in this site for development at the moment, but it is on the site allocation for potentially future projects. Have you had, so my question to you is, have you ever spoken with council officers, or has the community centre that you know of spoken with our officers from the council about this as a potential possibility, or was this the very first time you'd understood that the community centre and your organisation was actually going to be not on this one, but there's a potential future for it being in the project?
I'm not sure if I've understood the question properly, so our centre manager would deal with those details, but for me, my understanding was that the development would not include the Mitali Centre. It's just yesterday I just came across a PDF document and there's a call-in, and I was just taken aback when I saw that one of the call-in points was the envisaging the inclusion of the Mitali Community Centre. I hope I've answered your question. If you do get,
just to
yes.
be really crystal clear, you're a trustee of the charity, were you aware that the Mitali Centre was in the site allocation, SA 57, I think? Were you aware of that at all?
I'm actually not 100% sure what that means. But if you do write to us, or maybe pay us a visit, I'm sure we can dig up the information properly. Because I'm one of the trustees, but we...
I suppose I'm trying to understand whether or not you've had any
I
communication about this matter.
No, I don't know what FSA 57 even means. Sorry.
I wonder if at this point, just so that we don't leave that point hanging there, if an officer could just come in on that point there for me, please, just to clarify that.
And to clarify, do you mean to clarify the process whereby a site allocation is kind of identified and then consulted on? Is that? And I think probably, Emma, I wonder if you're best placed to describe the process whereby, so as I understand it, the Mithley Centre is a tenant of a council-owned leasehold property, and therefore kind of how we would expect for them to be consulted on the allocation of a site that involves that property.
So the process is that we would have written to the Mithley Centre and probably put up a site notice. I don't, because I didn't know about this deputation before I arrived. I haven't looked on our files just to 100% check that we did that. The thing about the site allocation is that if Mithley had been brought into the development now or was to be redeveloped later, then the site allocation sets out that the community facility should be replaced. So it wouldn't be that that there wouldn't be a community facility there.
That was very helpful. Thank you. Councillor Jogi.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for coming. I know you only had very short notice, so well done on you for coming and contributing to the meeting. Just a couple of points of clarification. One, how long has the centre been there and been operating? And can you just confirm whether you're supporting people from right across the borough? And I guess most importantly, what do you think this prolonged period of uncertainty would mean for you, the committee, and the people you support?
Since, was it 1989 or I don't have the figure. I think it was probably 1989, 1991, somewhere along those lines. But that's, I think that was our beginning. Yes. So for decades, and I'm not sure what it means. It appears to mean that the Mitali Centre will be somehow put at risk to pave way for a building project. That's what it just seems to me. Look, there's a lot of uncertainty about it, and I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not very well schooled in this, but I just don't like the uncertainty of it sort of hanging. And I just came in here. I thought it would be good if I just popped in. Oh, I think it was you who visited yesterday, wasn't it? Wasn't it? Oh, okay. I had a group of councillors who visited us yesterday, and I thought, what's going on? And then I was like, oh my God, there's a call-in tomorrow. Yes. But if we had a week or two, we could really prepare ourselves and come in. Yes. So.
What I meant, and that's very helpful, it wasn't me who was there, but whoever it was, very good-looking guy. But what I meant, though, was, and I understand the lack of time you've had to prepare, but I was more interested in the meaning of the uncertainty on the people you support. So less about the project and more about what you think the impact will be on the people who come to the centre, whose services, the service that you provide, that they rely on, if that makes sense.
Some of the people who benefit from the centre are very vulnerable women. We've dealt with a lot of women stuck in marriages, very abusive, violent marriages. They are not happy to go to the police. They want nothing to do with any official sort of institution. It worries them more. And the Mitali Centre has been running for a very long time. They would sort of know of somebody who has attended the Mitali and benefited in the past, so they very comfortably walk in. I wonder what it would. I wonder how they would feel, or a woman from that sort of section of the community, if that familiar building is no longer there. Again, I'm speaking on top of my head, so just.
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to take Yvonne, just because she hasn't spoken, and then I'll take Councillor Moeed, and then we might move to the Cabinet Member.
just want to help you out a bit here. This centre has been there for quite a number of years, and when there was a large influx of the Asian women that came into the area, there was a lot of unrest with them, and there was a group of us, 6 of us, and we used to run a children's group, and what we did was we tried to get them to come into us. The women would come in, but they would only stand at the door because they were really frightened. So what we did was we put the word out that that centre was there, and I can honestly say 50-odd women went to that centre in the course of a year for their support and help, and it gave them the understanding that the council wasn't a taboo place to go to. It had centres like that all over the borough, but what I found with those particular women, because they were kept down, as they say, they weren't allowed to have a voice in the house or anything like that. They were some of them were abused quite badly. So the idea of that centre being there, which it's been there, as he said, for quite a number of years, and I think if they did close it, what would happen to all those people that attend it now for support? That's the biggest problem we will have. Those people will have nowhere to go because they trust that centre, because they deal with the issues that they're aware of.
Councillor Moeed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chowdhury, and also Yvonne for your input in terms of the importance of this organisation. Coming from a Bangladeshi background myself, I do know of women who have directly benefited from the various projects and services that the centre has provided in the past and continues to provide. And congratulations on the anti-knife crime event that you described. I just want to pick up, you said that you were alarmed by the opening sentence of the call-in, which says, seems to give the impression that it's being, the current scheme, which has been signed off by Cabinet and also by the Planning Committee, doesn't include the Mitali Centre. So is it my understanding that you're alarmed that the call-in seems to suggest that the Mitali Centre should be included in any development? And is that why you're making representations today? Thank you.
Could I possibly ask you to repeat the question, if you don't mind?
So you mentioned that you are concerned that the call-in, the very first sentence, mentions that the Mitali Centre should be included in any development. Is that why you're concerned? Is that why you're making representations today?
Apologies. Thank you very much. I feel honestly, the Mitali Centre should not be included in the development, because I feel if it is included in this development, a very large number of people stand to lose out, and I think, yeah, and I really don't think it's fair. A lot of the people who come into our centre for support, it's very difficult to reason with them. Ms. Denny just gave an example, a woman coming to the door and being afraid to just enter in. I mean, because of the unknown. So a development which sort of includes the Mitali Centre makes the Mitali Centre disappear. I mean, I feel it's not a good idea. I think it'll be very unfair on those women. Even if we were to reallocate elsewhere, those women, they wouldn't go elsewhere. They wouldn't say, well, we now have those sessions in the Civic Centre. Oh dear, I think I'd better stay safe and not go to the Civic Centre. I'll continue suffering in peace and silence. I mean, I think that's the sort of, a lot of the people who benefit from us, I think yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Jogee, will you make it really quick?
I'll be really quick, Chair, and it's less of a direct question to Mr Chowdhury, more of a statement that I hope the Cabinet Member will note in his response. I think you were very clear about your concern and very clear about why you're here this evening, so I understood that very clearly. The one thing I would just want to put on record is I'm quite concerned that evidently the lack of communication between the Centre and the Council is so significant that Mr Chowdhury feels uncomfortable or unable, and I say that respectfully to you, sir, to be able to answer questions around the communication and the understanding of what the proposals look like. So I just want to note that, and when the Cabinet and officers respond to this deputation, that you can give us some understanding of exactly, and I respect and understand Emma's point that she didn't realise the deputation was taking place today, but clearly the impact that these proposals could have would suggest that we ought to really be prepared and under clear, clearly understanding the need to carry these community people with us, and I haven't got that so far this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr Chowdhury. You can stay where you are. We're now going to receive a response from the Cabinet members and any relevant officers where appropriate.
Thank you, and I'm just going to again respond briefly. Thank you, Mr Chowdhury, for your... Sorry, I should introduce myself. My name is Amina Ibrahim. I'm the Cabinet Member for Housing and Estate Renewal, and thank you for your deputation. I've understood what you're raising about the fact that there is an idea that the Mitterley Centre should be included, and therefore we should extend the site to include the Mitterley Centre. Now, what I need to be clear about is our report makes absolutely clear that the Mitterley Centre is not included in this particular scheme. What the call-in asks is that effectively for this scheme to be compliant, it should include the Mitterley Centre. What we're saying is that it doesn't. If we ever in the future were going to develop on the site of the Mitterley Centre, we would do that in consultation with yourselves, and my understanding is that you still have a number of years on your lease.
Thank you. Charles?
Thank you. I'm Councillor Charles Ajay. I'm the Cabinet Member for Finance and Strategic Regeneration. I think Councillor Ibrahim has answered the question. I think you should be pleased that the site, the proposed development does not include your site, which is what you're concerned about. If it were to have been included, then you would have been communicated with and you would have been provided, following consultation and discussion, an alternative site. So either way, you would have been involved. But from what you're saying in terms of your concerns, is that the development, contrary to what the calling is suggesting, you are not included in that, and I think you should be pleased with that, which is what you're seeking. Thank you.
Just one more kind of clarification. I absolutely agree with you. The Council should have always been in contact with you and your centre regarding any plans for the site. We will look into how that's happened in the past, and what I would also say is that the callers in should have been in contact with you about including your centre within their call-in.
I think we're going to move on to... We're going to have quite a long... Thank you. We're going to have a long evening, so I'm going to move on to the next bit of the meeting. Thank you very much, Mr Chowdhury.
Thank you.
And I'm going to call Councillor Carter, Councillor Davies and Councillor Gordon now, who are going to present their call-in. Some of you will notice that it's nearly an hour into the meeting before we present the call-in, and I make no apologies for doing that, because I think, after all, what are we here for if not to listen to the voices of our community? So sorry you've waited, but now you have your chance. Please go ahead.
Before I start, can I just say that we've broken it up into 4 sections. We're going to speak about why we've come here and why we've done the call-in. We'd then like to talk about why we believe that this is... why we think this is outside the policy framework, the financial framework, Then we'll move on to why we think it's outside the policy framework. And finally, we'd like to tell you what we would like to happen as a result of this meeting. So, and that's going to be broken up with Mike, Ruth, myself, and then back to Mike again. Is that okay? And we hope it won't last longer than 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, this is a building project which is out of line with the Labour Group's manifesto commitment to build council housing on our own land. That the deal represents a loss of 46% of council-owned land on this site is a matter we wish to place on public record. The proposal is for public money to be paid to a private developer in order to buy back land at a premium that we sold to the developer at a discount. All the homes built on this land, which belongs to the people of Haringey, will be homes sold at full market price. We will pay the developer a deposit large enough to satisfy the developer's bank that they can be loaned money to buy materials, and when we buy the homes in question, we will pay stamp duty. We will also settle the caution on the site, which is a debt to the NHS, for a sum likely to match what we are selling the land for. In effect, there will be £0 land receipts to the council. As councillors, and perhaps especially as ward councillors, it is our job to question whether this is the right thing to do. We believe that the council can actually deliver more homes here at social rent and involve adjoining land and neighbours in a better project than this one. We believe that, one, the decision of the executive does not fall within the budgetary framework because, one, it does not deal with Magic Living Limited, that does not meet that the deal with them does not meet with best value performance evaluations. Also, that due consideration has not been given to an alternative value for money evaluation on developing the site ourselves. We also believe that the decision of the executive falls outside of the council's policy framework because it fails to meet the criteria set out in the in the development documents SA 57, in the DM 11 and the DM 13, which deal with affordable housing. The conversion of the pub is quite possibly in breach of planning policy DM 50. The overall, as I began, the overall loss of 46% of council land within the site boundary does not match our key manifesto commitment to build council homes on council land. And finally, the decision does not match the commitment in the borough plan, which states one of our highest priorities is to start a new era of council house building in the borough, particularly using our own land. And I'll leave it there for now.
Ruth Gordon, Tottenham Hale, Councillor. The primary responsibility of an elected member is to carry out a fiduciary duty on behalf of the rent payers and of council taxpayers. As it's just been outlined, that we're talking about a land disposal here where we will relinquish 46% of the land on the site. That is to be paid for by public money from the Mayor and public money from the HRA account. And we are obliged to have best consideration according to our statutory duties. This developer comes along, and there's been previous iterations of this, of these plans, where the first fill came along with 12% affordability. Obviously, that wasn't going to go anywhere with planning. Then we saw that 35% affordability on behalf of these developers was said not to be viable for them. In other words, they couldn't make their 17.5% profit on 35% affordability. So what we've ended up with is 0% affordability because the council are providing all the affordable aspects of this deal. Magic Living, who will be buying the land off us, has certainly found a magic money tree and planted it in our backyard. What I want to come on to, though, is the question of procurement, because this hasn't gone out to any sort of procurement because it's been said that it is a land deal.
The newest report talks about the design and spec not being those of the council, not procured or commissioned, i.e. it's a straightforward land deal. But the Cabinet report, paragraph 614, 618, says this: Homes for Haringey has already been involved in agreeing the draft specification for the 46 homes and will be further involved in the detailed design of the scheme as it comes forward on the site. 614 says Magic Living has agreed to provide to standards required by Homes for Haringey. That sounds awfully like procurement to me. If it's procurement, and this is where I want clarification on that, then those two paragraphs are in contradiction to each other. And if it's procurement, it should have gone through the ODU process, which it hasn't. I believe as an elected member, then it's my duty to call this in, even on that one basis alone. We are losing 46% of our land and gaining 46 homes. Yes, that would be great for 46 families, as Councillor Ibrahim has already said. Is it value for money? I think that is in doubt. Let's take a scenario. They dig a ditch. They've got 6 months to start this scheme. Well, they might do that because they can dig a ditch in 6 months. They've got 24 months to complete the scheme. But in between that, we've got Brexit on Halloween happening. We don't know what's happening to builders, to Sparkies, to joiners, and so on. This is a small company. We don't know what their the due diligence that has been done. That is not clear in any of the papers. I think it's a bad deal. We don't want 46 homes on this site. We've been told by officers we can have 60 homes on the same layout, not including anything to do with Mitterley or the rest of this DPD site. But we can do it cheaper ourselves. We can have more homes if we build it ourselves. And we want to know why due consideration hasn't been taken to that particular option.
Oh, sorry. I think really you've only got 1 minute left.
Significant new information emerged at the Cabinet meeting. We now know that the Council does have the capacity to undertake a development of this size or larger. We were told that the issue was capacity to deal with disputed land disputes. We say drop the disputes. Build on land which is not disputed and which we believe is big enough for at least 60 homes. We believe that the information so far redacted and hidden in exempt papers should now be subject to full scrutiny. There is still confusion about the scheme, and this is how the Mitterley Centre comes into it. Some of the maps, the pub is not included and the Mitterley Centre is. Now, can we make up our minds where the red lines are on this development? We've committed to something where we're not even clear what the lines are. The viability assessment on the planning portal is almost all black line redaction in the financial sections. This is public money and public land. Why are we being so secretive about it? The report suggests that we would not get planning permission ourselves because the pub and the church would object. Leaving aside that these objections might not be valid or material, we were told in Cabinet that this assertion was actually conjecture rather than evidenced fact, and yet a decision was made on the basis of that conjecture. How can a scheme put forward by the Council itself not get planning permission? The officers have a duty to come up with something that merits approval. We believe that there are assertions in the report underpinning the decision which need to be challenged. These relate to planning permission, capacity of both the developer and the council team, land assembly, historic debt, and rights of access for third parties. And the other thing that we would point out here is we want the timescale comparisons challenged. We're told that it will take 2 years longer for the council to do it, but that's not been proved to us. And we also would like to point out in passing that in the scheme, we will not get anybody into those homes until all of the development is built. Whereas if we started it ourselves, we could put people in a few at a time as the scheme developed.
Thank you. I'll now take questions from the committee. While the committee is preparing its questions, I wanted to make a point of clarification. Councillor Gordon, you said, I think I'm quoting you, that you were told by officers that on the same site as is proposed 46 homes in this scheme, we could achieve 60 homes. Did I hear that correctly?
That's my understanding, yes.
Thank you. And I can see Lucy indicating, and she hasn't answered a question yet, so we'll take Lucy's question first, please.
Just on this comparison of 60 homes, on this comparison of 60 homes compared to 46, does this include kind of 46 homes which make similar provision plus more homes? I.e., is that with the same number of 2, 3 and 4 bedroom homes, and with the homes with disabled access, or is it providing 60 homes by offering some smaller homes instead of the larger homes? Because I think that would be a significant consideration.
Does the call-in have an answer
Yes.
to that?
At the moment, on the land that we own, 69 homes are being built by Paul Simon. The remainder of the homes are being built in the areas that are where the church is now, and the church is moving into the pub. So that actually 60 homes is quite a conservative estimate. There's absolutely no reason not to remain with the scheme and the size of the scheme as it is. It is actually quite a desirable scheme, and at no point have we said that we don't want anything built there. We want people to get a wriggle on and start building there.
Councillor Jogi, then I had Councillor Connor, then I'll take Councillor Moyed.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, colleagues. I've lots of scribbles here, but that was a very useful and comprehensive outline of your concerns. And Councillor Davies and Councillor Carter, particularly as ward members, I just wonder if you could outline how you think your residents would feel if they'd seen some of the redacted information that you've referenced this evening. And then latterly, well, I'll answer that first.
I can only speculate because I haven't seen any redacted information either, and it's been incredibly difficult for us to obtain basic information. I came along to the Cabinet meeting and was asked to leave for the exempt part of the meeting as if I was a member of the press and public, whereas it was a Chair's discretion as to whether I remained. Although eventually I was able to see exempt information, it was largely the same as information that was presented to us in the briefing that went out in May. But it has been really difficult, and there's still quite a lot of financial information there that I feel we haven't had any access to as ward councillors. It's been running to keep up. It's been an effort of detective work to find out exactly what's going on in this development in our own ward.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just a quick one on that. I think one of the keys here is that there's redacted information that's in the viability assessment. The viability assessment from last year that is publicly available says that 30% affordable is actually unviable. So interestingly, there's been a change from Paul Simon Magic Homes development of 30% affordable being completely unviable to one presently where there is now 60% affordable, which is viable. And one major difference that we all know is that the council is buying 100% of the affordable allocation. So, of course, in fact, if the council buys, as Ruth said, if the council buys 100% allocation of any affordable, then it makes every development completely affordable, basically. Yeah.
Can I jump in? Thank you, Chair. Oh, sorry, do you want to come back with?
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Lucy. If only we knew, because that's the problem, that we haven't seen the alternative. Now, the officer's report eulogises about one scheme that it is recommending, but doesn't give us an alternative as to how the council could develop the scheme within the red line boundaries. And we would like to know that. The actual allocation of 2, 3 and 4 bedroom houses, it mostly comes out under the Paul Simon Magic Homes scheme as being mainly 2 bedroom houses. Our need in the borough is for actually 3 bedroom houses, but there's only a small number of those in this scheme, and I'd like to see something else mapped out. But so I would be able to answer your question if we'd seen alternative an alternative mapped out by the officers.
Councillor Connor.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions, and this is really, I think, going to something that having read these papers, I shared a little bit of concern about, because I've got the QC's opinion, but we've only got a couple of sentences on it. So would you be asking for that, because that's the advice that the whole sale of the land is based upon? We've got it in 6.2.6 on page 11 of our first cabinet paper, allocation papers that we've sent. So would you ask that, or would you think it would be useful if you'd seen the full advice, the questions to the QC, as well as the response? And I'll ask my second question once you've answered that one. Thank you.
I think the short answer to that is absolutely and yes. There is issues about why this didn't go out to procurement. That's, I think, is what was where QC advice was being sought. And I think we have pointed out to discrepancies in the report, which gives us reason to suggest that there was at least a huge amount of doubt amongst officers. Otherwise, why would they have gone to the QC? I'd quite like to have known more detail and earlier, so that we could have had... I'm no lawyer, I'm no planning expert, I'm just a councillor trying to ask questions and get to the bottom of things that I think is related to my own fiduciary duty as an elected member.
Okay, so the second question that is the follow-up on that. So you've pointed out the Homes for Haringey have had specifications of the development once it starts. Now, my understanding is that the QC's advice said that we could dispose of the land under a sale and purchase land contract. However, because I was reading around this, in different things this afternoon, my understanding is, now this is where I was going to need advice because I am not a housing expert at all, but my understanding is that once a development starts, if the council places on the developer enforceable obligations to develop the land in accordance with plans approved by the relevant authority, i.e. us, this would then constitute a mixed contract arrangement which would be subject to procurement arrangements. Now, if that's the case, that changes the whole process quite considerably. But again, I'd like your thoughts on that, and then obviously we'll ask officers. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with that point. I think there are several points where we can perceive that there have been obligations. Now, when there's obligations on the partner that we are dealing with, then that deems it to be that we have procured those obligations. So it's not only the obligations that I talked to about the spec on the building that seems to have contradictory reports around it, but even the obligations about that you've got to start within 6 months, which is the rationale that has been given about how much quicker this scheme will be than if we build it ourselves. Oh, they're going to start in 6 months and they're going to finish within 24 months. Those are both obligations. It seems to me where we've got obligations, I can see the lawyers getting busy here, where we've got obligations that that means that that is part of a procurement process. If it's part of a procurement process, it needs to go through the OJU.
I'm going to ask a final question, and I think then we're going to move on. I wanted to just be really, really clear on what you were asking. You mentioned the possibility of understanding fully the option of the council building on this plot itself, on its own land. Is that what you're asking? You're asking that you see a costed up proposal for that?
The answer to this is actually wrapped up in my summing up, which I wasn't able to do. And I'll just get the summing up of my summing up, which is that we are very much in favour of a development on this site, which has been neglected and derelict for too long. We believe that the Cabinet decision is flawed, as it was based on limited information without due diligence being given to alternative options, plural, wherein the Council remains faithful to its manifesto promise, builds far more social houses on the site for less public money with more certainty of completion. We are here to ask Overview and Scrutiny to exercise its essential functions in relation to ensuring that this decision is revisited and is subject to full scrutiny.
Thank you. Councillor Moyed and then Councillor Jogi, and then we will move on.
Yes. Councillor Hakata, you referred to site allocation 57, which talks about the inclusion of the Mitterley Centre. And well, I'm grateful to the Chair for allowing the Chair of Mitterley Centre to, for giving them the parity of steam, which is really important. But my question to you is that both of you, Councillor Hakata and Councillor Davis, as ward councillors, when we were doing this call-in, did you think about consulting them before putting them into the text of your call-in? That's the first question. The second question is, we have the report here that tells us that, I agree with you. Your preference is direct delivery, that we should build our own homes on our own land. Absolutely agree with that. And as Councillor Ibrahim mentioned, that there are 500 new homes in the pipeline, of which 350 will be built by ourselves. That is absolutely the preference. But if on this site, on this particular scheme, if we were to do that ourselves, we would not get started until 2022, and they won't be completed until 2024, which is beyond the lifetime of this administration. Do you agree that there is absolutely no guarantee that any of them will even be re-elected after this, this administration? So how can you possibly contemplate something which is not even in our control?
Okay. I have actually made a number of attempts to contact the Mitterley Centre. I've managed to, actually went to the centre myself yesterday with colleagues and met Mr Chowdhury there. I don't think he confused us. But actually, it was the first time on going to the centre that anybody had actually been there, and I've tried the email address and I've tried the mobile phone number, so it wasn't for want of trying. I agree with you. I think it's absolutely awful that Mr Chowdhury discovered yesterday that the Mitterley Centre is inside that red line area, depending on which map you look at, because they're different. When we talked to him and said, did you know about it, he didn't. And I think that's a real fault in this, because there are users of that site, including actually the Roman Catholic primary school. There are users of that site who have an interest in any development there, and I get the impression that the only people talking to them actively is Magic Homes Limited, because, he hadn't been visited or been spoken to about it. So that's the first thing. On your second point, we can't just keep accepting that it will take 2 years longer for the council to build its own homes unless we've got the proof in front of us. You've just been told that. To just simply say, oh, OK, then that's 2 years that we can't afford is simply not fair. We're asking for a proper officer proposal that for something to be worked up, something that isn't biased, that is absolutely open about where the strengths and weaknesses are of all the different schemes. What I'm unhappy about is simply going down the shops and buying 46 homes off a developer.
Thank you. Look, I'm conscious that members have lots of questions, but we are going to have lots of questions, opportunity for questions also with officers and cabinet members. I'm going to take Councillor Dohan because he has patiently waited and hasn't spoken for quite a while, and then we're going to move on.
Thank you, Chair. So, Khalid, you just mentioned that 500 homes in pipeline. Could you explore where you get that information from?
Sorry, Aldo. In paragraph 1.6, it says, the strategic report elsewhere on this agenda identifies a number of sites on which the Council can deliver these homes and notes that over the next 12 months, the Council is aiming to achieve 500 planning consents for new council homes and for 350 new council homes to have started on site by the Council delivering directly.
Okay, well, let's move on to the Cabinet member's response to the call-in presentation, and then we can cover off that question if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I thank colleagues for their presentation. I more or less, I think I've outlined my introduction in the Cabinet report, and obviously I stand by that. In terms of the issues that's been raised, I'm sure we can unpick those when we go into more details. The issue of procurement, and I think that's been raised, and as the councillor is aware, it says that it's a sale and purchase arrangement because it's land that is we're talking about, so you do not need to go through the OJU process on that. Again, the issue of a number of if you take like the head list, for example, in terms of the arrangement that's been made, that is contained in the exempt part, so obviously I cannot discuss that at this point. I do share your frustration, I think, in terms of the fact that as we all have to do, it's in the Council's constitution. I think it was alluded to by former Councillor McNamara in terms of the Council's constitution. So I believe that a need to know, under the requirement of a need to know, both ward councillors requested to see those information, and I think they were provided with that information in terms of all the commercial stuff. So I don't think it is fair to say that they were not provided with that information. So on that, I will stop there, Chair, but to thank them for their deputy calling.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to be brief as well because I know this is your opportunity to ask us questions. So, yeah, I would like to thank the call-in. Just a couple of points of clarification about the issue raised about if we develop the site ourselves, we could achieve 60 homes. Yes, that's correct, and it would be cheaper. That is also correct. Nobody has ever denied that. And we've also always said that it's a on-balance decision, and the reality is the balancing act was between speed and between the fact that that there were issues around ownership or control, not ownership, control of the land. They are the factors that are at play here. So yes, we could achieve 14 extra homes at a potentially cheaper price, but again, that is a possibility, it's not a certainty. So at risk of not going into too much detail, because I'm conscious that there are going to be questions, it's a gamble. Everything is a gamble. It's a gamble to, now let me finish, it's a gamble to wait 2 extra years potentially for the hope of an extra 14 where potentially you could achieve 0. This is actually not a gamble. It's 46 guaranteed homes to start in autumn, and there is a there is a clear commitment to the timelines, and I'm not willing to take that risk with those 46 families, to say to them, actually, hold on, sit tight in your disgusting accommodation, because actually we could potentially achieve 14 extra homes, or we could potentially achieve 0.
So we've had Cabinet members' responses to the call-in. What I'm suggesting now is that we move in. I know that members have questions for Cabinet members, but I'm suggesting we move on to the next item in the agenda, which is the officer report responding to the call-in. And at that point, then we'll take questions for Cabinet members and also any more detailed questions for officers, if we're happy with that.
So I'm happy to present it, although I don't think that really amounts much more to simply drawing your attention to the report. So as ever, the reports are in 2 parts. There's a report from officers from my department of the council on the on the scheme itself, responding to the points in the call-in. There's a separate report from the monitoring officer, as is always the case with call-ins, on some of the technical points on the budgetary and policy framework. What the report from my report, or the report that I signed off, does is that it goes through, makes a detailed response to each of the 6 points that are raised in the substance of the call-in. There's a separate report which responds to the elements which relate to the exempt parts of the Cabinet report, and they're contained in a separate exempt report to this meeting. And then finally, it also responds to the proposed kind of variation of action that was the substance of the call-in. I think rather than repeat this material in the call-in in the report, I think for the sake of brevity, I'll take it as read. But obviously, I'm extremely happy to either myself or members of my team to answer specific questions on the report, if that's the easiest way to do it.
Thank you. Councillor Jaggi was indicating.
Thank you very much, Chair. I suppose the main thrust of this question could be answered by both Cabinet and officers, and that's around the timeline. Dan, where does this 18-month to 2-year period come from?
So we, as part of our emerging programme for building council homes, which of course is looking at a great deal, many more sites besides this, we've worked up a kind of indicative average set of timescales for what it takes to bring a site forward. Now, of course, they are only indicative and average because every site has its own characteristics, different sizes, different land conditions, etc., etc. But what that indicative kind of average process shows us is that the work that we would need to undertake from a standing start to get to the point where Paul Simon are now, that is kind of with a scheme and the planning consent ready to go, would take between 18 and 24 months. That's the work of doing an initial feasibility exercise on the site, of commissioning then architects for a detailed design, and then taking that detailed design through planning. And our emerging development procedures effectively indicate that that's the average amount of time it would take.
Thank you. So just to unpick this, so 18 months to 2 years for 46 homes, for 60, right. So, and there are now, as Councillor Moeed points out, 500 in the pipeline of in terms of the 1,000 commitment in the 4 years. So on that basis, and just help me understand this, does that mean we have 300, sorry, for the next 3 years, we'd have 500 homes. Sorry, let me the other way around. So we have 3 years to build 500 homes, based on the numbers that we've just had shared here. Do you see what I'm trying to get to in terms of? Next 12 months.
If I understood it right, it's a question about the kind of where are we on the trajectory towards 1,000. So what Councillor Moeed was referring to was that, I think what that report says is that we expect to get 500 planning consents within the next calendar year. I think that was, so it's by May 2020, because that was an estimate that was made in May this year. So that's not the total pipeline, it's just that section of the pipeline which we expect to have got planning consent by that point. The delivery against the 1,000 target, I hope this is a good way to describe it, will be hockey stick shaped. That is to say that most of the completions come, by definition, the way this kind of programme works, at the end of the programme. So it's not a kind of straight line, because all of the schemes, because we're kind of starting the programme last May, all of the work on the kind of feasibility and the design work and getting planning consent happens for all sites in the early stages of the programme. We have also said, and this is a really important point, that the programme is a mixture of sites we develop ourselves and sites which we directly deliver ourselves, where which is always our preference because we control the quality much more. It tends to be cheaper. And the sites where one way or another we are kind of working with a partner, either to buy through Section 106 homes developed on another site, or as in this case, working with a partner on a site that involves some or all of council land. Those 500 planning consents and the whole of the trajectory towards 1,000 includes a combination of those different kinds of delivery methods, and the earliest kind of batch of delivery will be in the stuff that's being built by others, because quite often we're stepping in at a stage where it's already got planning consent or is already in the pipeline, and therefore the completion of the homes will be that much sooner. Anything that we're directly delivering ourselves, by definition, wasn't on the books until we started the programme last year. Does that answer the question, or at least partly?
Yeah, okay. Well, I've heard that. Amina, can I ask you, a political question here. You've said, and I tried to make sure I've written down everything as you said it, said that there's a balance between speed and control and a gamble was the word you used, and that and that it's possible. Now, my view my view is that everything is possible, and if we can deliver more homes at a cheaper cost, why wouldn't you try to push that and speed that up?
Absolutely, and on all sites you would aim to do that, but then there are always going to be sites where there are particular issues, this being one of them, where control of the entire site isn't ours. You know, there's been various toing and froing about whether it should include the Mitterley Centre. Obviously, if it included the Mitterley Centre, you would be able to kind of deliver more there, etc., etc. My point about it being a gamble is that ultimately what you would have to do is go through that whole planning process which Dan spoke about, hope to have achieved. You would need a number of things to be in place at the end of that 18 to 24 month period to guarantee that you would deliver those 60 homes. If they're not there, you don't deliver the homes. Whereas here, we've got the planning permission was achieved, it was in the pipeline, and we have a guaranteed start on site. So, yes, I would say sitting tight and waiting possibly 2 years to achieve planning consent ourselves for the site, which is dependent on achieving full control of the site, would be a risk, actually. And I think it would be on balance for an extra 14 homes. And there was also the point that was made about going to the shop and buying the homes. Well, actually, no developer builds, or even when we build it, they're not free. There is a cost attached. What we're not disagreeing about is a direct delivery model is cheaper in the long term. It's just in this scenario, when we don't have full control of the site, this is our least risky alternative, which carries an element of guarantee of delivering those 46 homes.
Thank you. Now, there's a number of people in the chamber nodding as you speak, and they've been very keen to call people out on consistency over the years. So I'm just interested, final question, Chair. How consistent or are your answers with the Labour manifesto that is now the Council's focus and plan that we were all elected on?
In terms of delivery of council homes at council rents, so yeah, on council land. So what we committed to was delivering council homes on council. How consistent? Absolutely. It reduces our target by 46 homes, and they're all council homes on council land. Comparison was made with the Haringey development vehicle. This is not comparable. The Haringey development vehicle did not commit to secure tenancies. We would not have been collecting the rent. These will be council homes. This is not a long-term partnership. The homes are built. We take our homes, everybody goes their separate ways. There is no 25-year deal for 50-50 ownership of the land. Then they have no involvement in the collection of the rents or the tenancies whatsoever. This is a straight transaction. That's what it is. We get our 46 homes at council rents, which are delivered within the time frame, and that's it. Bye-bye. Absolutely, and you're right to point that out, but the reality is that many schemes, to achieve 50% is a really, really good outcome. What we hope to achieve with our own land is higher than that. In this case, we are actually getting more than 50%, and they're all at council rents. And the idea that these homes are overpriced or at market value, that's not correct. They're below the GLA benchmark, and ultimately That's where I've sought assurance, because I wasn't clear either. I wasn't clear about the transaction which involved the land being disposed for £500,000. What I was assured of is that nobody is getting discounted land. Anybody who's involved in this scheme is paying the full, independently assessed value of the land, because it involves... Because it involves... no, that's public information, Charles. Because it involves a element of social housing, it unfortunately reduces the value of the land.
Can we just confirm, officers? I'm not sure if we've forayed into exempt information.
I think just to mention to the committee and also to officers and members as well, that there needs to be a bit of caution. I understand the frustration in the sense that there are significant parts of the report which are in the exempt part, and there needs to be a bit of caution to actually make sure that information which are in the exempt part are not disclosed in the public part of the report. And this matters are best reserved once the committee withdraws into the exempt item to actually discuss these items.
I have some questions relating to the site allocations that I wonder if both Cabinet members and officers might want to address. One was to explain to us simple people what the purpose of the site allocation document is. And another was to just highlight for us what I understand that the developers created a master plan and what that envisions for the Mitterley Centre, what that plan envisions. And finally, I had a question around what assessments had been made as to the condition of that building, its maintenance and future cost and future requirements.
Okay. So when the site allocations development plan document is part of the local plan, and it's within that SA 57 sits. And so we have a high-level housing target and target for jobs and development that comes down from the Mayor. In broad terms, when we produce the local plan review, we then have to make a decision about where we think that development could be located. And part of the process of doing that is what we call a call out for sites. So we would speak to developers, put adverts in papers, basically get people to come and tell us where they think there are sites that could be developed, and we obviously also do that ourselves because we and you also know this borough really well. So after that process, basically we came up with this document, the site allocations DPD, which was adopted after probably a 2 to 3 year process in July of 2017, and SA 57 sits as part of this document. So hopefully that makes sense.
Just to follow up on that one, could you explain, because it might seem obvious when I read it, but I think it's worthy of a discussion, what the document means by, on page 4 it says, this document enables the refusal of proposals that do not conform with the allocation. Could you just clarify what that means?
So, in effect, so if you were actually proposing something that was completely different, so if an office development, for example, was proposed on this site, that wouldn't conform with the site allocation because this site allocation is mainly a housing allocation. There is other wording in here. I'm going to struggle to tell you the actual page now, but I can look for it. There's other wording in here that basically talks about wanting sites to come forward comprehensively. So it's true to say that our first port of call would have been for this to come forward with the Mitterley, but we can't insist that things happen comprehensively because we understand that there are different ownerships on particular sites. And so what we're basically looking for is, because we think that the optimum use of this site, and the way that we could get the maximum use of this site within density guidelines would be for all of it to come forward. What we would be looking for is a master plan from anyone that was only bringing forward part of it to demonstrate to us that what they are proposing to do doesn't prejudice bringing forward the rest of the site. So planning application for this site basically shows a plan for how the Italy could come forward at a later date, and it basically shows there's in effect a blank wall that's left on the side of one of the blocks that we've resolved to grant planning permission for, where another building would basically be attached. But the site allocation is very clear about replacement of the community facility, and so any future proposal that would come forward would basically need to do that.
Just to be really, really clear, for simple people like me, the blank wall, can you explain that? You mean on one of the new buildings, or...?
So on one of the new buildings, basically the side wall that a building would butt up next to it on the Italy would basically be built one blank brick wall against another brick wall.
Okay, and I had a final question, which was around what assessments had been made as to the condition, maintenance and management of the Italy Centre itself.
So that's not a planning issue, so I'd have to pass that on to Dan or Steve.
Yeah. So it's short answer is I don't know, and to be honest, and I could certainly check because that does come under the remit of my property team. The important point to stress, though, is that because at no point did this proposed scheme include the Italy Centre, there wasn't a need to make that assessment in specific relation to this proposal, if you see what I mean. Of course, the council, as a landlord, has responsibility to kind of understand the condition of the buildings it's letting and its tenancies. But that question hasn't come into the consideration for this, so I don't have that information at my fingertips. We could find it, but we wouldn't be able to do that tonight, if you see what I mean.
So I think, just to add, I don't believe that there was any of that work done in relation to coming up with the site allocation, rightly or wrongly. I think that this was basically, in one sense, an ideological kind of decision about what would deliver the most development. And it was quite clear as time went on that it would be quite complicated to bring the Italy in because of the length of time that they had left on their lease. And so that was, I mean, to be honest, that was also one of the reasons for the delay in this scheme actually progressing to planning committee. But we decided quite a while ago that it would be better to basically leave that capacity to be brought forward later, and that it was too complicated to deal with the Italy at this point.
Just a response on that, because specifically the Italy Centre comes under the brief of community buildings and it's within Councillor Blake's portfolio. But just to be clear, partially I can, because I know a bit about the history of community buildings in the borough, it's dependent on what the relationship is and what the lease is with the council, because many community buildings have different arrangements. Some of them are just on peppercorn rents but were responsible for the repairs. Some of them are on full repair leases, etc., etc. So without knowing the details of what the Italy's arrangements are with the council, we wouldn't know, because they were allocated at different points in history. From my understanding, the Italy Centre was from 1990, but then there were community buildings which were under previous arrangements on circular grants, etc. So it is a bit untidy everywhere what all the different arrangements are.
Councillor Dohan.
Thank you, Chair. So I got a couple of quick questions. So first question goes to Amina. So during the discussion that we had today is more about the capacity, that whether council has the capacity to build to its own land. So could you just clarify if we do? If we don't, have you looked at alternative options such as neighbouring boroughs? Do they have a capacity? Or did you explore those options? And then I got a subsequent question.
So I think there's been some confusion. So with this specific site, it was the fundamental issue was never a capacity issue. The issue which was made clear in the Cabinet report, because I know some people have said that there are some errors in the Cabinet report which suggest that what's stopping us delivering it directly is capacity. That's not the case here. We certainly have the capacity to build a site of this site. That's not what the blockage is here. The blockage here is speed and full control of the land, because there are sites which many councillors have lobbied me about, which are quite vast and quite huge, where we would have a capacity issue. This isn't one of them. Actually, the point on joint work with other boroughs is a really important one. So we're looking at doing some work with some neighbouring boroughs on where they are with their direct build programmes, because the reality is for us, we started in last May from a standing start, and that's why we've this year approved that plan. There are boroughs which are a couple of years in, which we can learn from.
Councillor Corn, I think you had a follow-up to that question.
So, page 5. So if you look at the risk, the planning risk, and at the last paragraph you talked about there are major challenges in assembling the whole site and reaching agreement with the pub and the church. So how did you come to that decision? Did you have a conversation with the pub and the church? And secondly, there's another question I want to ask. So the fear homes, you say that there is no guarantee that the owner of the church and the pub will wish to would wish to collaborate directly with the council. So how did you come to that conclusion?
So obviously this is the planning part of it, and I know that there is some discussions that have been taking, because this has been something that's been coming forward since I think 2015, and there's some history, because I believe there has previously been direct contact and possibilities with the council. So I can't comment on that simply because I wasn't around then, or I wasn't in a position, I wasn't in a decision-making position. But in terms of the church, my understanding is that the issue is specifically related to control of all of the site, which there's some kind of historic agreement on, but also so what I'll do is I think the planning issues are more historic ones, which I think Emma can probably answer better.
I'm not aware of those either, I'm afraid, because that's before my time.
I'll try and navigate a path through this. So the planning risk would arise for the council. So as we've heard, the planning policy, the site allocation, makes clear that the preference is for the whole site to come forward as in one piece: the council land, the old pub, the church, the Mittley Centre, and that any kind of departure from that approach would need to be kind of justified in terms of why it's not appropriate to bring those other parts in, and how the scheme will allow for those other parts to be brought in future. The council, if it decided to bring forward its own land on its own, as is being proposed, would have very crudely two options. It would either have the option of trying to go ahead just on the bit that the council owns. In that scenario, it would have some planning risk, because my housing development team would need to convince the planners that there was a good reason why we weren't bringing in the other bits of land, and that would be particularly hard given that we know that there's a viable proposition on the table that does bring in the other bits of land. We would also need to show that the scheme that we were developing could incorporate development of those other bits of land in the future. Now, we haven't done any detailed work on kind of whether and how that's possible, but that would certainly be a challenge for the team. And that would be a planning risk for the scheme in that scenario. The alternative scenario is that we try and do the same thing that Paul Simon Magic Homes have done, and construct a development proposal which brings in the church land and or the old pub land, partly because that would result in more homes overall. And of course, one of the jobs that I have, as well as meeting the council's target for council homes, is a target to meet the number of homes overall. We've been set a plan by the Mayor of London for the total number of homes of all kinds to build, and that's part of my job, is to deliver on that target. but that in that scenario, we would have to obviously come to an agreement with the church and the public house. Now, this goes back before my time, but I think I'm right in saying that the council had in the past tried to reach such an agreement and had found it challenging. Obviously, we'll be entering that anew, and one can't make any assumptions about what that would be like in the current environment, except to say effectively that we don't know. So there's a risk that that would not be possible, or if it was possible, that it would eat more time. And obviously, given as we've already talked about, time is one of the factors here. That's one of the reasons why we advised against that approach. But we can only describe it in terms of risk, because we don't know what the appetite would be, what the issues would be in those conversations with the owners of the public house and the church. We don't even know that that's the track we'd choose to go down. As I say, we'd have the options, but neither of those options, on officers' advice, was as appealing on balance as the option which we proposed and which Cabinet approved.
Councillor Moyd.
Dan, it's a question about the non-viability of the various options that you've mentioned in your report. And I don't think we've had an opportunity to actually understand what those options were that you considered and why they were discounted. In particular, I would like you to touch on where you say fewer homes would be delivered in any scheme solely on the council-owned land, and how that compared to the deal that we've achieved now, which includes both the pub, the former Duke of Cambridge, which is no longer a pub, it's Golden Sands Bar, and the church. So the difference there and how that leads to, if we were to build ourselves, fewer homes.
Sorry, and Dan, can I add on to that then, that the comment that we had earlier from the call-in presentation, which was about 60 homes potentially being delivered on that site. So perhaps you can marry those two things up for us.
So I think one of the issues here is the total number of homes, on one hand, that will be delivered in the two scenarios, and on the other hand, the number of council homes that could be delivered in the two scenarios. So I think what is the scheme that's got planning consent is, I'm looking at Steve, 88, is that right? Sorry? So across the whole site, it's 88 homes of all tenures. So, and I don't think there's any claim, as it were, that total number of homes could be achieved on just the council land. And we would need to do much more work to figure out whether, if the council brought forward its own land on its own, whether the other bits of land, if and when they did come forward, could bring that total up to 88, or could the piecemeal development would at very least put that at risk. What we're saying effectively, the total number of homes, it's 88 known against something like 60. In terms of the total number of council homes, it's 46 known against, if you like, a maximum of 60. But part of the work that we haven't done, I'll be very clear about kind of the fact that we haven't done it, is to understand whether we think that a development of 60 homes on the council-owned land, let's assume that is the right number, although we haven't kind of done detailed design on that basis. Let's assume that is the right number. Whether we would be recommending that they were all council homes, because the blunt fact of the situation is that even with the increasingly generous grant that we get from the GLA to build council homes, council housing is not on its own viable, which is why every borough across London that has a council house building programme is looking at market sale as a way of achieving the extra subsidy that you need on top of the grant from the GLA. Now, we know that we have to build market homes to subsidise council homes across the programme in the borough, so at the Red House, as at every other site, we'd have to make a judgment about whether we need to introduce some market housing into that scheme in order to balance that scheme against all the other schemes that were in the programme. So, yes, we could opt for 100% council homes on that site if we chose to, but those market homes required for the subsidy would pop up somewhere else in the programme, if that makes sense. We can't run away from the fact that we need market homes in the council programme in order to give us the subsidy that we need. So, I hope that answers the question and kind of makes that distinction adequately between the total number of homes of all tenures and the number of homes of council tenure.
And the alternative options that you've considered and discounted?
Yeah, I mean, discounted is a strong word, because as we've said all along here, it's an unbalanced decision. I don't think we're discounting any options. We're just saying that, that we know that the council direct delivery is an option in both of those two alternative formats that I described in the answer to Councillor Dogan's question. And there was the further option we looked at of the possible disposal of to a housing association, although we didn't really see why that offered us anything that the other options weren't already offering us. I certainly, I agree with Councillor Ibrahim. I think the officer analysis was the same as the cabinet member analysis is this. Our advice was an on-balance judgment, taking into account the factors that we knew were the priorities for the administration in terms of balancing kind of time, cost, and quality, and so on. So at no point did we discount any of those options, but we certainly considered, we considered them to the extent that we felt was appropriate before we arrived at an on-balance recommendation.
I have a follow-up, given the comments you've made and some of the comments that Councillor Ibrahim made, which is, I wonder, are there things that you didn't consider that you wish you had considered now?
It's a fair question.
It's an officer question and a political
question. Sorry, I'll answer the officer bit first, I beg your pardon. I think from an officer point of view, no. I mean, obviously, one possible answer to that is, should we have done a lot more work on the feasibility of a council delivery scheme? Now, as I talked about in the answer to Councillor Jogie's question, the further we'd have gone down that path, the more time it would have taken. And given the time factor that we've already talked about in this decision, we made the judgment that, on balance, we knew enough, looking at our indicative analysis, about what that would mean in terms of possible capacity of the council land, the time it would take to work up a scheme and so on, to say that, on balance, we didn't think that was worth it, because part of the purpose of recommending what we were recommending was the speed of delivery, and specifically delivery kind of within the lifetime of the 1,000 homes commitment. So I can't think of anything that I wish I'd done that we haven't done, I have to say, from an officer point of view.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think you'll probably be aware, as well as with other colleagues, that this was originally in the forward plan some time ago. And had you asked me that question a few months ago, before there was a bit of a delay because there were lots of questions that people wanted to ask, etc., etc., I would have probably said, yeah, I want to know this, I want to know that. But I think actually, because there's been lots of questions about this from councillors, from colleagues, I think it's given us the opportunity to kind of reflect and look at each thing and still come to the conclusion that it's an on-balance decision. But again, from the start, nobody's saying that this is how council homes should be delivered across the board. It is simply the on-balance option for that particular site. In a perfect world, I would like us to be able to obviously have full control of the land, but work together with the church as well, because let's not forget, we've talked about, I'm really thankful that, we've been able to hear from the Mitterley Centre, but actually the church is a key player in this as well, and they've got their independence, they've got the right to make their decisions and to choose which party to engage with. We can't compel organisations to come to the conclusions that we think would be preferential. And I'd also say, I mean, the reality is, in order to make this scheme work, we'd have to look at building a church. I don't necessarily think building religious buildings is what councils are best at, actually, and it would be difficult to make that argument. I also wanted to come back to the equalities point that was raised earlier in the deputation. There is actually a whole section, so I'd correct Natasha if she's still here on that. There is actually a whole section of the report on the equalities issues, so it certainly doesn't say it's not applicable. And actually, an important equalities consideration is the church and is the Mitterley Centre. So we certainly have considered all of that.
I've got a couple of follow-up points. I suppose a cynic might say we're enabling the developer to rebuild a church with help from our finance. However, I'd also make a point as the chair of Scrutiny. I think we had a presentation about Red House in April, and I think I asked a question then, and I've had that question answered today, and I've asked that question repeatedly since then. And so this is a point about the journey that we go on together, and it was around site allocation. So I've had that answer today, and to some extent I was clarifying what I had read in reports. So it's about the journey that we go on, and whilst I can appreciate you're saying we wouldn't change anything. Actually, as much as I love being here, I think if we go on a different journey, we might not be here. But I think Councillor Connor's got a question.
I have indeed. So I'm going to go back to the very good point that was raised by my colleague, Councillor Gordon, a while ago about the whole procurement exercise. So I'm going to start with the advice from the QC. So when we do scrutiny, the one thing that I can absolutely guarantee you is that we'll go through all the facts and we will look at it in detail. We have got absolutely nothing from the QC other than those couple of sentences in the report at 6.26, which was the Cabinet one, and then it's repeated in our scrutiny one for this evening. So two questions from that would be, one, is there a full report somewhere, and whether we could actually have seen that, whether it was in this main bit or an exempt. The second question is that did Cabinet read the full report? Because, to be honest, we've got an answer to a question, but we don't know what the question was. So we've got that the QC, who obtained the opinion that the term agreed in the heads of term attached is, for all intent and purposes, a sale and purchase contract of land, and therefore outside the scope of the regulations, which is the public contract regulations. So that's the first part of the question, because, to be honest, without seeing what that QC was asked, we don't know how that answer was phrased. So I'm really aware that depending on what you ask a barrister or a QC, whichever the term is, it will give you a different answer on that. So did the Cabinet see the QC's full report? The second question I'd like to then really just go back to is the question that we raised actually as part of the deputation, was that we've been told from this QC that you can do the sale, so you can do the, dispose this land and the sale and purchase of the land contract. However, if, and I think we've highlighted today, that actually the council's placed on the developer certain obligations which we have already identified tonight through Homes for Haringey, the Homes for Haringey section. Also the fact that we are asking the developer to develop council homes so that we can buy back. So we've actually asked that. So we've put enforceable obligations to develop the land in accordance with plans approved by the council. So basically the council has asked the developer to do something with that land. If that is true, then wouldn't this constitute a mixed contract arrangement which would be subject to procurement regulations? So therefore, we should have gone through the Public Contract Regulations 2015, and this should not have been done under a sale and purchase of land. And the reason that I'm pressing this really hard tonight is because when I was on Google, because I couldn't find anything near here, to be perfectly frank, I found a 2018 report from the Court of Appeal on the Faraday case with another council, whereby the Court of Appeal set aside a concluded land development arrangement between a local authority and a developer because they have found there was a breach of procurement legislation, which was, and Dan I'm sure knows all about this, the council had asked for that developer to develop certain things on that land. Now, as I said, I only Googled it and I have no actual proper knowledge, and so this is why I'd like a really clear answer to that, because if that is true and we go down this path, aren't we putting the council at risk by doing something that we shouldn't actually be doing?
Sorry, I'm not clear, Pippa. Who was your question directed at? Because you were looking at me all the way through. I'm not the lead member for procurement, so I presume that that question was directed at Councillor Ajay or specifically Dan. Yeah.
Okay, I'd say both. I'm sure Dan knows, and there might be legal advice on that, but I'm sure Councillor Ajay would have something to say on this.
I'm not a cabinet member for procurement either, but so I won't necessarily speak to that. But there's a legal officer here that dealt with the case. I'm sure he'll be able to provide answers to the points that you raised.
Patrick Hughes is principal lawyer. You're quite right that the court found that in Faraday that where the primary purpose of the contract is works obligation, then it does fall within the public contracts regulation. But this is not the case here. The case here is based on two separate transactions. The first transaction is the disposal of land by the council. That disposal imposes two long stop dates on the developer. And the primary reason for that is to prevent the developer from land banking the site, and therefore just sitting on it and not carrying out the works that he's supposed to be doing. That's perfectly normal in a land transaction, and the European Court of Justice has found that this is quite outside the public contracts regulations or the EU procurement rules. And what the council also has put in there to protect itself is an option to buy that land back if the developer doesn't actually do anything with it. And this is the option that goes with those long stop dates. Separately, the council is buying properties from the developer, but is only paying for that once those properties have been completed. In an ordinary transaction where you buy properties, even if you were to buy a house, you would buy a house based on certain standards. You would go to your estate agent and you say, this is the kind of house that I need. So it's quite normal to have standards when you're buying properties. And this is what the specification is all about. The council cannot just go and say to the developer, well, build any properties you want and I'll go and buy it from you. So you have to set out those standards. If they don't produce those properties to that standard, then you don't buy it. But there is no obligation on the developer to do anything. At the point when the council exchange contract, all they are doing is paying a deposit, and that deposit is not actually paid to the developer. It's actually held in a separate account, and it's not released to it until completion happens. And after the work has been built, and the council is satisfied it has been built, that's when it pays for those houses. That's when completion takes place. So that's an ordinary purchase contract, which happens just the same way as when you buy a house, you pay a deposit, and when your transfer happens, you pay the 90% of it. And this is very similar to what would happen.
So can I come back on that? So what I've understood from you, and you just said there was no obligation on the developer to do anything. So does that mean that we then may not buy those back if that developer... So are you saying that we are actually not tied into this? And it is, so in legal speak, we sell it and we might... There's a possibility that we can buy it back, but the developer, and I wasn't sure what you meant, there was no obligation on the developer to do anything. And the second part of that comes back to that QC's advice again, because if that QC, he said it was his opinion, he didn't say it was fact in law. So he didn't say this is absolutely categorical, he said it was a... Oh, no we're not, it's on here. It's not an exempt. So it's not an exempt.
Quote where you are, please.
Yeah, so the
Councillor
QC...
Connors is going to explain where she is in the documentation, so we're clear that we're not in exempt.
So the QC has obtained, whose opinion is that terms and their heads of term is attached for all intents and purposes, sale and purchase contract to land, and therefore outside the scope of regulations. So I'm asking what you meant by...
So that's page 11, paragraph 6.26.
So yes, it's in there. So it's just to be really clear, so what do you mean by no obligation on the developer to do anything? Does that then mean that we may or may not be buying those council homes back, potentially? And the QC whose opinion this is, isn't it now even more important that we actually see a full report from the QC on what was actually asked and actually what the facts are, because that is just an opinion. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can we just say about the QC stuff then? We just have a...
So, Chair, I think what you have in the open part is an outline of the advice. In the exempt part of the report, there's a bit more detail, a bit more flesh to the bones of the exempt part. And I think we're gradually slipping into the issues raised in the exempt part. These issues can actually be explored in more... Chair, these issues can actually be explored in more detail when we actually move on to the exempt part.
So sorry then, okay, so I'll take that as an exempt if that's a problem, but the second bit is about the QC's report. So firstly, can we see that report from a scrutiny perspective, but actually more importantly, did Cabinet see that QC's report? Thank you.
It's not normal to, it's a matter for the monitoring officer. It's not normal for officers to disclose legal opinion that's been given to the council.
Sorry, just to be really clear, so not maybe just the council, but to the actual Cabinet, who are the decision makers, and they need all the information available to make the decision, have they seen the full report?
We have not. I certainly haven't seen the QC's report. What normally? Excuse me. What normally happens, Chair, is that you get the borough's solicitor explaining the advice that's been sought from a QC. That's always been the case. I've never been privy to a full sight of a QC's report. So it's the borough monitoring, the monitoring officer's comments and advice that we go on.
Can I respond to that as well? And that is, it's based on the fact that we employ a legal advice, we employ a borough solicitor who gives us advice based on reports that have been passed to them. I don't think this is what you mean, Councillor Connor, but are you suggesting, I'm hoping it's not what you mean, that we should not take the advice of the monitoring officer and the borough legal advice and say, no, we want to see the direct report ourselves, because that would be second-guessing officer advice. And are you suggesting that they've given us false information? Because I don't think that should be acceptable, actually. And I really think we should, and what I'm seeing here is an element of what I think perhaps isn't meant to come across that way, but an element of contempt for officers.
Okay, sorry, hold on. Okay, sorry, thank you everyone. I find that comment deeply unacceptable. I think that the reason that we're here in Scrutiny is not for fun. It's here to do a role. We're here to perform a function. We are here to question the fundamentals, the things that we assume in the council, the assumptions that we make. It is quite simply that. I think, on my colleagues' behalf, I find that offensive. So I would like, personally as the chair of this meeting, to apologise to my colleague here on my left for having to listen to quite that kind of comment. I think it's not on. I'm sorry, Amina, it's not on.
Councillor Das Neves, I appreciate your response. However, and if it's caused offence, I apologise. However, I do feel that what we need to have a culture of doing here is showing trust in the advice that we're given. Yes, there are opportunities to scrutinise that. I have no reason to disbelieve the advice that was given to us.
Hi, thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, please.
Thank you for that, and I really appreciate that comment, Chair. Actually, the reason I was asking is because we'd only had a couple of sentences about the QC's advice. And actually what I wanted to know, because it's not clear in here, what advice you were given in the Cabinet, or what advice other than that was given, because it's not in the report. And as the Chair's quite rightly said, we need to scrutinise and make decisions based on facts, and we haven't got any facts other than that one sentence in front of us. So it is not, there's no thing, I am not sort of saying anything about officers' advice, it's just that I don't know what the officer's advice is because it's not in the report. So that was purely a question just to find out whether you'd had advice, what the advice was, whether we could see it and scrutinise it. So it would be useful for us to know in scrutiny on a factual basis. Thank you.
I have a very concise question to ask, but before I do ask that, I've got to put it on record that you're not ensuring parity between the committee members here in the way that you've allocated the time. All evening I've had my hand up, you've looked at me, you've ignored me, you've not allowed the opportunity for me to come back on questions. No, hang on, this is a very important point, and if you don't believe that I'm correct, then you can look back at the webcast to see the amount of time that you've allocated other members compared to myself. So the question that I have got is that in Dan's report, Dan, you've mentioned that some of the policy concerns which have been raised by the call-in have actually been addressed by the planning subcommittee, which met and which approved this development. So could you touch on that, please? So it's in the second dispatch, page 3, 4.6.
So the issues about the referred to in part 4.6, so for those who don't have the report in front of them, this relates to the first reason in the call-in, which was about the complaint that the proposal is not compliant with the DPD brief, which envisages the inclusion of the Mitterley Community Centre. So I think I'm right in saying that those are the issues which Emma's already answered in terms of the way in which, through the decision that was made by the planning committee, in order for the planning officers to recommend approval and for the committee to approve it, the applicant needed to be able to demonstrate that their proposals, which did not take account of the full site allocation, were nevertheless consistent with the development across the full site allocation in a way that would enable the rest of the site to come forward in future. And as Emma described earlier, she was able to recommend approval of that planning application because of the way that the applicant explicitly described the way it had tackled and addressed that requirement that's articulated in the site allocations DPD. Does that answer the question?
Thank you, Dan. Do we have further questions?
Well, I don't have any questions, but I think that clearly just being a bit unfair to the chair, because I think you had a substantial time to ask your questions. I only asked 3 questions, I think, so far. So you had sufficient time.
I need to come back because Councillor Dohan mentioned me, so I need to respond to what he said.
Actually, as the chair of this meeting, I'm not allowing this conversation. That's not the purpose of this meeting. I'm not allowing the conversation to continue.
He's mentioned me by name, so I deserve a right of reply.
I am the chair of this meeting, and you either adhere to the rules of the meeting or you'll leave.
I deserve a right of reply.
Simple as that.
Well, you're asking me to leave.
I don't think I had much of a right of reply.
No, you're asking me to leave because I said I deserve a right of reply.
I've made it very clear. I'm the chair of this meeting and we will continue on to the next part of the meeting. If members don't have any further questions, we'll move on to the next part of the meeting. Stephen, I think you're going to present the Monitoring Officer's report.
Thank you, Chair. The Monitoring Officer's report is on... sorry, terribly sorry. The Monitoring Officer's report is at page 13 of the second dispatch. The purpose of the Monitoring Officer's report is to advise the committee in respect of the call-in process, also on the question as to whether the decision made by Cabinet is within the budget and policy framework.
So before you move to the Monitoring Officer's report, I think any other councillors in the room have the opportunity to ask questions.
Thank you, Councillor Ibrahim. I think Councillor Barnes was indicating. Oh, sorry, apologies. It's a long night.
Thank you. It has been a really long evening. So I'm going to keep my questions very brief. And for clarification, I'm Councillor Palmer, and I'm the Liberal Democrat spokesperson for Tottenham. My first question. So, Dan, you referenced that you'd been to both the pub and the church some time ago, but hadn't been back very recently. Personally, if I were going to do a deal as important as this, and perhaps knowing it would be controversial, the first thing I would have done is to have gone back. So I guess for me, I just wonder what led you to not go back and try and speak to both parties before you did anything this recently. My second question, and I've got three, sorry, they're very brief. My second question is that the papers argue that Paul Simon was selected, as we've kind of mentioned, on the basis that they can start work this year and complete in 2021. Though I note in the report that only says an anticipated finish date. Now, given that they have already failed to do anything within a 3-year window, and given that they also now have a further 3 years, so potentially they won't deliver in 2021, and they'll actually ride into the same timescale as you yourselves would have done. My final question is to my two colleagues, Cabinet members here today. I just wondered if you would agree with me that the call-in procedure is an important democratic process and that no councillor should ever be disciplined for submitting a call-in. Thank you.
Shall I do my bits first? First part was why in kind of reaching our recommendations didn't we approach the owners of the former pub and the church to understand, to extrapolate, I think from your question, tell me if this is wrong, to understand how we might have been able to work with them in a council-led scheme. And the answer to that, I think, is that in the end, the answers to those questions wouldn't have changed the fundamental truth of the fact that, however willing or unwilling they would have been to cooperate with the council, we still would have been looking at this 18-month to 2-year delay to bring a council scheme forward, because whatever their level of cooperation with us, that wouldn't have changed the fact that that's the amount of time it would have taken us to get a scheme up to and through planning, according to our estimates. So it didn't feel that that was a central question on which our advice turned. That was why we didn't address that. You also ask about, if I'm understanding it right, the kind of the degree of confidence we have in delivery of their anticipated completion date because of the delays they've been up to now. It's fair to say, in all honesty, that the delays that there have been, which led to the expiry of the original agreement we had with Paul Simon Magic Homes, were more, I'm afraid, to do with council action than they were to do with the delays of Paul Simon Magic Homes. So there were, for example, some discussions which went rather back and forth. I think colleagues of mine might have more detailed information about this, but there were some colleagues that went back, some conversations with them between the council and the developer that went back and forth about whether or not we were prepared to accept a scheme that did or didn't include the Midley Centre site. And there were some other negotiations, I think, on other elements of the proposal where the council was struggling to reach a view. So actually, our judgment, and I accept that it is a judgment, but our judgment, our professional judgment as officers, is that Paul Simon that our opinion of Paul Simon is not affected by that delay because those were kind of council-driven issues rather than by them. So of course it's a judgment because we can't be certain about what will happen in the future, but we certainly have no reason not to take on trust the fact that the amount that they've invested so far in the scheme to get it up to and through planning means that they are kind of committed financially, apart from anything else, to seeing it through. I don't know if colleagues want to add anything specific on that, but that kind of covers the main point.
Thank you. And on your third point about councillors being disciplined, I am not aware that any councillor has been disciplined as a result of the calling. But I should add, however, that I'm not going to be discussing Labour Party policies in terms of the rule book and standing orders in the public or with the Liberal Democrats for that matter.
Thank you, and I would just personally like to thank the Chair and Deputy Chair for their actions this evening. Thank you very much for fair chairing.
Thanks. They do say you can never keep all the people happy. Bob, did you have a question, and then Noah?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Well, when you come to these things, you find that so many of your points you would have liked to have made have now disappeared. But I do very much take the point that was made by, I think, Councillor Davies, that it's very hard to understand the lack of confidence that the council scheme would have, would not have delivered more homes or could not have delivered the community space, and that negotiations would not have been successful. So just make that comment. It's not a question. One question I have, just regarding Magic Homes, because it's in the public domain, it's been there for quite a long time, about the Parnwell estate in Peterborough, where Magic Homes behaved pretty appallingly and evicted 72 of 74 families pretty quickly the moment they acquired that estate. And they clearly, they may have had good commercial reasons for doing that, but I find it hard to accept that that developer will not be equally commercially minded with us. And should things get tough, should it be hard to deliver, I can imagine a report coming back to Cabinet at some point, because I've received them on as a member of Planning Committee, whereby sadly a developer is not able to deliver what was originally expected in the planning permission or in terms of quality of the housing. And we invariably have to give in. And I just would like the Cabinet members or the officers' response to the choice of Magic Homes and the expectation that they will truly deliver what is proposed in this paper.
So I might say something about that. So I think that there's two parts to my answer to that. Other colleagues may want to chip in with further thoughts. But so point number one is that they've reached a point, having got this kind of up to and through planning, and obviously through some quite kind of lengthy negotiations with the council over the land transaction and so on, where they've invested quite a lot of time and obviously money in this scheme so far. And if they were to kind of to not deliver now, they would be very significantly out of pocket on that investment up to date. So I think you can take some comfort from the fact that they are heavily incentivised to complete the scheme, and I would say in particular to complete the element of the council homes, because at the moment, and you've heard a bit about some of the risks in market housing, at the moment, by far the greatest certainty for them in terms of a sale is the sale of the council homes to us. That's always true in any private development, that actually having an upfront buyer for the affordable homes is one of the things they always try and lock in, so they'll be very keen to make sure that they deliver on what they've promised to sell to us. The other point is that they are they have a reputation, particularly in Haringey, to protect. I mean, they've done things in the past in Haringey, and I'm sure they would expect to do things in the future in Haringey. Given the profile that this scheme obviously already has, which partly explains why we're all here tonight, the last thing they would want to do is for that not to come off, for them to have been seen to let the council down, because that would obviously very significantly damage their relationship with the council, with the community, and their ability to do business in Haringey in the future. So, quite apart from, as it were, the wider due diligence that we did on the company in terms of its financial standing and so on, I would say that kind of from our... And yes, of course, they will behave commercially, and we know any private developer that we're dealing with in any context is going to behave commercially. That's the nature of the beast. And we should expect of ourselves a degree of ability to, just as you say, we should have confidence in our delivery ability, which I do, by the way. We should also have confidence in our ability to behave commercially when we need to. And I'm confident that our understanding of their commercial position and their commercial incentives means that our judgment that they will deliver is one that I have confidence in.
Thank you. I had Councillor Tucker, Councillor Carlin, and Councillor Diakides.
So Noah Tucker, St Anne's Ward, and I obviously am one of the local councillors for the ward in which this proposed development is going to be built. So my first question is around the funding for the scheme, or any potential scheme on this site, particularly access to grant money from central government. So currently we're getting around or exactly 100k per unit of social housing. That comes via City Hall, but this is not money creation by City Hall. This is central government funding, and it depends on a continuation or possible changes in that policy by central government. And of course, we've now got a new Prime Minister. So my first question is, does a potential 1.5 or 2 year delay in building on that site bring with it the potential risk of losing that 100k funding per housing unit on that site? So that's my first question. My second question, I'm raising this because some language has been used this evening comparing this current development with the Haringey development vehicle, and myself and others here today were very much involved in fighting against the HDV, and therefore a comparison between this scheme and the HDV itself has to stand up to some scrutiny. Now, the HDV, to my understanding, was actually based on destroying existing council homes and replacing them with homes, majority of which were market homes, but a minority, up to the level of the previous council homes, would have been homes at social rents, but not at secure tenancies. And if Cabinet members or officers could clarify, we're in a situation here where there are going to be 3 blocks built on totaling, I understand, 72 homes on the land which is currently owned by the council. Of those, 26 homes are going to be private homes, market homes, to be retailed by Paul Simon or whoever they appoint, and 46, so almost twice that number, will be council homes at council rents, going to people who desperately need accommodation on the waiting list and in temporary accommodation. My question is, how on earth can any comparison possibly made with the HDV?
Sorry, before you respond, we are, given the time that we have now remaining, and the fact that we still have quite a lot to get through, including some exempt information, I'm proposing that we invoke Committee Standing Order 63 and suspend the Committee Standing Order 18 and continue the meeting after 10 p.m. Is that agreed?
Yeah, agreed.
I'm just going to give a short answer to the end of that, because I think there are bits of it that are probably more appropriately answered by others. If comparison of this to the HDV, I mean, if anybody compares this and thinks that it's similar, they clearly didn't read the papers on the HDV.
On the grant point, yes. So the current building council homes for Londoners grant from the Mayor of London, which, as Councillor Tucker says, is money that originates with central government, is based on, can only be granted to homes which will start on site by March 2021. So if we're right that we're looking at a period of 18 to 24 months for, as it were, starting whenever we took a decision to start a council scheme to get to planning, let alone to start on site, I think the answer has to be yes, that there's a risk that we wouldn't make it by that cut-off and that there would therefore be a risk to funding. And there certainly is no certainty about the programme that would exist after, for any homes started after March 2021. So I think that risk does exist.
Councillor Tucker, I wonder if you'd had any comment on whether or not we could have insourced this piece of work, given that you were till up to really recently Cabinet Member for insourcing.
I'm very, very happy to answer that question, because I was not only the Cabinet Member for insourcing, because I had the Council's property portfolio in my brief, I was also the relevant Cabinet Member for this particular programme. And I would say, in my view, there is no contradiction at all between support for this scheme and the overall aims of the Council in terms of insourcing. And I would say for two reasons. So, first of all, because it is, I wouldn't say an absolute priority, but it is a huge priority of this Council to increase the public footprint in terms of housing and the ability of the local authority to offer local people housing that they can afford. And our programme of building or ensuring that there are built of 1,000 council homes comes exactly into that category. Secondly, in terms of insourcing, insourcing needs to be realistic. We need to step on the gas with it, but it needs to be realistic, and we need to know that we can deliver. And to make insourcing the kind of priority that means that we would leave 46 families either in the kind of appalling conditions which Councillor Ibrahim has described or completely homeless, I think would be a dereliction of our duty as a local authority. We are building the capacity, and I believe Councillor Ibrahim will confirm this, that we will have a direct works unit that is actually able to go far beyond the situation of dealing with contractors, push developers aside and put us in a situation where we are directly developing on our own land, but we're not there yet.
Thank you, I think, for not quite answering the question. Sorry, can we? But I'm conscious of time, so Councillor Carlin and then Councillor Diakides. I think we're going to move on.
I appreciate that we stopped the earlier discussion because we were concerned that this would stray into exempt material. However, I'm not sure whether I'll be allowed to stay in for the exempt part of the discussion, so I would like to express my concern now, even if I don't get a response. From what I understood, what we have said is that the reason that this scheme is considered to be a sale and then buyback is because there will be two contracts. The first contract will place no obligation on the contract for sale, will place no obligation on the Paul Simon Magic Home, and then we will buy back the properties if we are happy with them at the end. And I'm concerned that this is incredibly risky, because the whole point is that once we've sold the land, it is no longer our land. Once we've sold the land, and if that contract for sale does not include very, very strict criteria about what is done on the land, we have no control. You say that Paul Simon Magic Homes has worked on this and therefore they're going to go ahead with what we want, but there's absolutely no guarantee of it, because once we've sold the property, the land, then all that comes into play is whether or not the planning criteria are actually met. And so, in actual fact, that answer has raised huge concern for me. We are selling a piece of council land, and then after, with no, you're saying absolutely no criteria attached, just a sale. Once it's gone, it's gone. Once it's gone, Paul Simon Magic Homes can do whatever they want, and there's nothing we can do. We don't own the land any longer. And I would like to leave that. I can understand that that maybe can't be answered now, but I really wanted to express my extreme concern, and actually I'm completely flabbergasted we're even in this position.
Councillor Diakides, please.
Similar what I wanted to say, I just want to put it slightly different so it will save time if I put it straight away. Am I right? My understanding is that in order to justify not applying the OGU requirements, we had to present that as a disposal, a sale, which meant then we couldn't really enforce the particular conditions like the timing and the type of units and all that kind of thing that will be there beyond what is in the planning permission. All right, that kind of thing. If that is the case, all we are left with, and I assume you look at your papers later when it is the private session, that it does say that the council has got an option, if they meet the specifications, to buy these 46 units, but if they don't meet these specifications, the option not to buy them. In the light of that, if that is the case, isn't the case that the statement that it is guaranteed that we will get these 46 units is inaccurate? It is definitely not the case. Am I right on that? And if I can add a little right there, I am flabbergasted as a planner myself, head of planning in the past and all that kind of thing, that you say that it takes 2 years in this particular case for the council to secure a planning application in a straightforward site. I would like to know how you explain that you take here 2 years to give yourself a piece of land you own, a planning permission for a straightforward scheme that you know what you want in. I really am amazed, and if it is the case with this one, from the 350 other ones that is proposed to do ourselves in, are they all going to take 4 years to be completed? You know, because 2 years for planning permissions.
Are we able to respond to any of those in this section, or are we just going to answer them in exempt?
So I think most of it in the exempt. I would say that for the last part of Councillor Diakides' question on the timescales, I was at pains to say earlier, and I'll say it again at risk of repeating myself, that 18 months to 2 years period is a kind of average. I'm afraid it does take that long, and we've experienced lots of forms of frustration at how long it takes to bring these sites forward. It's a process that incorporates both the kind of formal planning application process and the formal public consultation that has to sit alongside that, which has a number of weeks attached to it. But counting back from that, there's all the work that's done on the detailed design, and before that on all the feasibility work, the searches on title, engagement with the local community, which of course we could decide to shortcut, but we've made a very clear commitment not to, and so on and so on. So not every scheme will take 2 years. Some will take less. Some, I'm afraid, are likely to take more. But it's that length of time which explains the kind of hockey stick of delivery that I was referring to earlier, which means that actually the delivery will all be, if you like, certainly the stuff that we're directly delivering ourselves will be overwhelmingly back-ended, if you like, towards the end of the period of this administration. I think on the contractual details, I'm afraid I don't think we can really get into that stuff without straying into the exempt territory, so I'm inclined to say let's reserve that for then.
Right, that it is not accurate to say it's guaranteed.
When you say it is guaranteed, what do you mean?
Scheme as it is. You discussed in the exempt part, but it is true that you can't say that it is guaranteed.
That's correct. We can't guarantee that they will build it, and but there are plenty of safeguards in the contracts which protect our interest in that scenario.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Let's now move on to Stephen's report. One line.
Chair, I'm conscious about the time, and also we've got we need to also go on to the exempt part. You have the monitoring officer's report in front of you. I take it as read. And just 2 points I need to mention. First, the fact that the monitoring officer's advice is that the decision is within the policy framework, relying also on the officer's report. But also, you also have the advice from the chief finance officer that the decision is actually within the council's budgetary framework. That is the budget for 2019-20 and also the MTFS for 2019-24. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Stephen. Councillor Moyeed.
Stephen, the question is really, we've heard from the first deputation, and also I think some of my colleagues who are signatories to the call-in have said that the decision should go back to the Housing and Regeneration Scrutiny Committee. Could you confirm that that is actually not an option that is available to us? We, as the Overview and the Scrutiny Committee, are not empowered to actually send it back to the Housing Regeneration Scrutiny.
Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, but we could make a recommendation to Cabinet that we thought that that's what should take place.
In respect of the actual call-in decision, that needs to go back to Cabinet if you're minded to actually come to that conclusion. Okay. In addition, as well, in terms of the actual committee's wider remit, it is possible for you to take a view that there might be certain aspects of this decision, post-decision making, whereby you may actually want, say, the scrutiny panel to actually have some oversight. Again, that's entirely a matter for the committee to determine.
Thank you both for clearing that up. I'm now going to move the motion to move on to the exempt part of the meeting. What will take place is we will have, you can all stay if you really want to. We're going to move to another room. The committee will move, and the three councillors who've brought the call in, and we'll have, but we'll have a 5-minute comfort break because the chair needs one. Okay. So in rooms 1 and 2, please. That's the committee. Which bit that? And I have to read the official piece of text. Sorry, everyone. That the press and public be excluded from the remainder of the meeting as the items below contain exempt information as defined under paragraph 3 and 5, part 1, schedule 12A of the Local Government Act. Information relating to the financial or business affairs of any particular person, including the authority holding that information, information in respect of which a claim to legal professional privilege could be maintained in legal proceedings. Thank you. Okay, 5 minutes in room 1 and 2, please. Thinking about going home?
Yes. I don't
know. I don't think I'll
stay.
stay.
If I was just asking, is it normally councillors?
They can come in as well.
Yeah, have they got, so have they read the exempt? They have it.
They've had the exam. They've had the exam. Remember. Okay, thanks everyone. So we've reconvened after our exempt part. We're still going in here and reporting back on our decisions. I'm not going to do a précis, but suffice to say that we thoroughly discussed all the exempt items and raised strongly the issues both that came up in our deputation and from other councillors. It is the decision of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee that the key decision taken by Cabinet that was the subject of this call-in is within the policy framework of the Council. It is also the decision of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee that it is also within the budget framework of the Council. I'm assuming we're all agreeing that?
Yes, agreed.
Both of those? Yes, thank you. But it is also our decision, I'm right in saying, that we would like to refer this decision back to Cabinet on the grounds that such a numerous level of questions and issues were raised that we feel it indeed merits a relook and reconsideration. And in that context, our recommendations are broadly to be tightened up in textually, but are broadly in the themes of deferring this decision until the until a alternative option, which involves direct delivery by the Council, can be fully costed and can be shown, can be given to us or shared, that shows what we could deliver with our own direct delivery. Excuse me. The committee felt very strongly that the borough plan emphasises building council housing on council land, and that we must honour that commitment by maintaining the freehold of sites where we can and building those homes ourselves. We felt strongly the executive should consider how we record and share the professional legal advice that we receive in the interest of transparency, and that the Cabinet should consider how that information can be made available, even if it is only as an exempt item. We felt strongly that when sites and allocations came forward, a process of identification of all key stakeholders should take place, and that they should be included in that process, following on from the deputations we had from Italy Centre. And that all reports that come forward should make very clear what consultation had taken place, what engagement, and who those stakeholders were. It was correct so far?
Yes. Yep.
It was the strong view of the committee that clarity and consistency around the boundaries and borders of sites across all documentation would be helpful and important in avoiding confusion, and that the Cabinet should seek to increase the trust, accountability and transparency with members of the public, and consider seriously how it would do that through its key decision-making processes. The committee also recommends that all housing-related key decisions should have their own standalone equality impact assessment that fully demonstrates the risks and how those will be mitigated. The committee would like to see better coordination between teams when they're providing information and materials and reports that sit across their variety of teams but have common elements. And the committee would like to be would like Cabinet to be very clear on the reasons for the choice and selection of developers in future disposals of land, acquisitions or procurements, with at least the recognition that transparency requires clarity over why organisations and businesses are selected. And the committee also finally agreed that we should consider bringing forward some of the aspects and issues raised this evening into our own work plan, which we will do in due course. Does that all sound correct to everyone? Agreed? Well, I think we're done. Thank you very much, and special thanks to officers.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you.